Have you ever wondered what it truly felt like to wake in a world where winter was not an inconvenience, but a living adversary? Where the simple act of dressing each morning became a ritual of survival, layer upon careful layer, against cold so deep it could stop your breath in your chest. Tonight, we drift backward through time to the vast Siberian frontier of the 18th and 19th centuries, a place where temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, where forests stretched endlessly into white silence, and where the clothes on your back were not merely garments, but the thin barrier between life and a frozen death. We will explore the forgotten ingenuity of ordinary people, the materials they trusted, the routines they repeated season after season, and the quiet desperation woven into every stitch. Before we begin this gentle passage through winter's ancient grip, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, you'll find yourself here again whenever you need these late-night journeys into forgotten corners of the past. Leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me where you are, what hour it is where you sit or lie. Some of you may be wrapped in stillness deep in the night, while others greet a quiet morning or rest somewhere between. Now let the room grow dim around you, perhaps turn on a soft fan, or let the hum of silence settle in your ears. And let us step together into the cold. The darkness before dawn was not merely an absence of light, it was a presence, thick and crushing, and within it you lay curled beneath whatever coverings you possessed. Felted wool blankets worn thin at the edges, animal hides stiff with age, perhaps a scrap of linen patched so many times it barely held together. Around you the zemlyanki, your partially underground hut, offered only the barest protection. The walls were logs chinked with moss and mud, the ceiling low and blackened with years of smoke. You could hear the wind outside, not as a distant sound, but as something that pressed against the structure itself, seeking entry. And you could feel the cold, not as a chill, but as an ache that settled into your bones even as you slept. When you opened your eyes, the air stung the inside of your nostrils. Your breath emerged as a visible cloud, pale and ghostly in the dim red glow of embers that still smouldered in the central hearth. The first task before anything else was to assess your clothing. During the night, moisture from your own body had seeped into the fabric and frozen there, leaving your garments stiff as boards, cold as iron. You could not simply pull them on. To do so would be to encase yourself in ice, to invite the cold directly against your skin, where it would leach away your warmth within minutes. So instead, you rose slowly, joints protesting, and moved toward the hearth. You fed it carefully a few precious sticks of birchwood, a handful of dry moss, and coaxed the flames back to life. Then you draped your clothing near the heat, piece by piece, and waited. The waiting was its own kind of suffering, standing there in your underlayers or wrapped in a single blanket, shivering, watching the frost gradually melt from wool and leather. The first layer was always linen or hemp, rough woven and unbleached. It lay against your skin with an unpleasant coarseness, the seams often still damp from yesterday's exertions. You pulled it on slowly, feeling the fabric resist your movements, cold and unforgiving. Then came the woolen shirt, so heavily patched that you could barely recall its original color. Perhaps it had been grey or brown, or some indeterminate shade between. Each patch represented a tear, a moment when the fabric had given way under strain, and each repair had been executed by your own hands, or those of someone in your family, stitching by dim firelight with fingers that ached from cold and repetitive motion. The wool itself was never soft. It had been spun by hand from sheep, whose fleece carried dirt and lanolin and the scent of the animal itself. Over this came felted leggings, thick and heavy, that trapped moisture against your skin and itched constantly. They were made from wool that had been beaten and pressed until it formed a dense, nearly waterproof layer, but this very density made them stiff and uncomfortable. You pulled them up over your legs, feeling them catch and resist, and tied them at the waist with a length of braided cord. Then the outer furs, these were the most precious items you owned, perhaps a coat made from reindeer hide or a patchwork of rabbit and fox skins sewn together over the course of several winters. The fur was matted in places and frost had collected in it overnight, forming tiny crystals that glittered in the firelight. You shook it gently, watching ice fall to the earthen floor before pulling it over your shoulders. The weight of it was immense. It pressed down on you layer upon layer until you felt less like a person and more like a moving bundle of fabric and fur. Your hands came last, and they were always the most difficult. First, thin inner gloves made from rabbit fur, then heavier mittens constructed of felt and leather, the seams reinforced with sinew because ordinary thread would snap in extreme cold. But even these were not enough on the coldest days, and so you had learned, as everyone learned, to keep your hands moving constantly, to flex your fingers inside the mittens, to never let them rest for too long. Your feet required equal care. The boots, valenki, made from compressed felt, were warm but nearly useless in wet snow. Moisture seeped through them within hours, and once wet, they became frozen vessels that trapped your feet in icy captivity. So you lined them first with dried moss, packed carefully around your wool-wrapped feet, and over them you pulled crude overshoes made from birch bark or strips of leather, anything that might provide one more barrier against the snow. Even this was not always sufficient. You had seen frostbite before, had seen the blackened toes of neighbors who had stayed out too long, and you knew that each day was a careful negotiation with cold that never forgave carelessness. The dressing process was not quick. From the moment you woke to the moment you stood fully clothed and ready to face the day, a full hour might pass, sometimes more. And during this hour you thought of nothing but the mechanics of survival, which garment to warm next, which seam might tear today, whether your mittens would hold together through another day's labor. There was no room for other thoughts, no space for plans or dreams or even much in the way of feeling. You simply moved through the ritual step by step, as you had done yesterday and the day before and the day before that. Outside, the world was a study in white and grey. Snow lay deep across everything, smoothing the landscape into gentle, deceptive curves. The forest beyond your settlement was a dark wall of evergreens, their branches heavy with accumulated snow, and between them the spaces were filled with a pale, diffused light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The cold was a physical thing, a pressure that pushed against your face and found its way through every gap in your clothing. You breathed through a cloth wrapped around your mouth and nose, because to breathe the raw air directly was to invite pain deep in your lungs, a burning sensation that could linger for hours. Your eyelashes froze together with each blink. Your eyebrows collected frost. If you had a beard, it became a mass of ice within minutes, and you learned to break the ice away periodically, a small ritual repeated throughout the day. The work began as soon as you were dressed. There was always work, wood to be split, snow to be cleared, animals to be tended if you were fortunate enough to have any. Each task wore at your clothing in its own way. Splitting wood frayed the cuffs of your sleeves as they rubbed against rough bark. Carrying loads pressed the seams of your coat, stressing them until threads broke and had to be repaired. Even walking through deep snow abraded the leather of your boots, grinding away at the material grain by grain. You moved stiffly, encumbered by layers, your range of motion limited. To bend at the waist was difficult. To reach overhead required effort. You had learned to move economically to avoid unnecessary motions, to plan each task so that you wasted no energy in redundant movements. This was partly practical necessity and partly a kind of meditation, a way of narrowing your focus until the world contracted to the immediate and the tangible. By midday, moisture had accumulated inside your clothing. Your own sweat, trapped by the layers, had dampened the innermost fabrics, and this moisture now worked against you, drawing heat away from your skin. You knew this, had experienced it 1,000 times, but there was nothing to be done. You could not remove layers during the day without risking exposure, and so you simply endured, feeling the cold creep closer with each passing hour. Food, when it came, was eaten quickly. There was no lingering over meals, no savoring of flavors. You ate for fuel, consuming whatever was available, perhaps a porridge of barley or oats, perhaps dried fish, or a strip of tough, salted meat. The food was barely warm, cooling rapidly in the frigid air, and you swallowed it mechanically while standing near the fire. In the afternoon, if there was time, you tended to your clothing. This was not optional, it was as necessary as eating or sleeping. You sat near the hearth with your sewing kit, a scrap of leather folded around a few precious needles, a spool of thread you had spun yourself, perhaps some sinew saved from a butchered animal. You examined each garment systematically, searching for tears, loose seams, places where the fabric had worn thin. The light was poor, even with the fire, and you had to hold the fabric close to your face, squinting at the stitches. Your fingers were never quite warm enough for fine work, never quite nimble enough, and so the sewing was slow and imperfect. But it was necessary. A small tear today would become a large one tomorrow, and a large tear could mean the difference between enduring and succumbing. You patched holes with whatever material you had available. Often this meant cutting a piece from a garment already beyond repair, robbing one dead thing to sustain another. The patches were crude, the stitches uneven, but they held. That was all that mattered, that they held. You greased your boots with animal fat, working it into the leather with stiff fingers. The fat helped waterproof the material, helped keep it supple, prevented it from cracking in the extreme cold. The smell was rancid and unpleasant, but you barely noticed it anymore. It had become part of the background scent of your life, along with wood smoke and unwashed wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of winter air. Sometimes you scraped ice from your outer coat, using a dull knife to chip away the accumulated frost. Sometimes you hung garments near the ceiling, where the rising heat from the fire would dry them, watching steam rise from damp wool like ghosts departing. These small tasks filled the hours. They were repetitive, meditative in their monotony, and they occupied your hands, while your mind drifted into a kind of empty calm. As evening approached, the temperature dropped further. You could feel it happening, a gradual tightening of the air, a deepening of the cold that seemed to have no bottom. You retreated into your dwelling and began the process of preparing for night. This meant checking every seal, every gap where wind might enter. You stuffed fresh moss into cracks in the walls. You adjusted the hide that covered the doorway, making sure it overlapped properly, that no sliver of outside air could slip through. Then you shed your outer layers carefully piece by piece and hung them where they would be ready for morning. The inner layers, damp with sweat, you left on because you had nothing else to wear, and removing them would leave you too exposed to the night's cold. You lay down again in the darkness, pulling your coverings over you. Around you, you could hear the small sounds of your family or neighbors, breathing, shifting, the occasional cough or murmur. These sounds were comforting in their familiarity. They reminded you that you were not alone, that others endured the same struggles, the same quiet desperation. Sleep, when it came, was not deep. You woke frequently, disturbed by cold or discomfort, or the need to check that the fire had not died entirely. Each waking was a small crisis, a moment of assessing whether you were still safe, still warm enough, still alive. And each time, after determining that you were, you drifted back into fitful rest. This was your existence. This was what it meant to live on the Siberian frontier in winter. Not adventure, not exploration, not anything that future generations would romanticize. Simply this: waking, dressing, working, repairing, enduring. Layer after layer, day after day, a slow and grinding struggle against cold that never relented, against conditions that permitted no mistakes. Your clothing was not fashion. It was not expression or identity, except in the most basic sense. Identified you as someone who had not yet frozen to death. Every stitch was a small act of defiance. Every repair was a refusal to give up, even when giving up might have seemed easier. You owned very little, perhaps 2 sets of outer garments if you were fortunate, more likely only one. You owned your boots, your mittens, your scarves and belts. You owned the needle you used for repairs and the thread you spun by firelight. These things were your wealth, more valuable than coin, because they were what kept you breathing. The wealthy, you knew, lived differently. In the towns, merchants and officials wore coats lined with fox or mink. They had servants to help them dress, stoves that actually heated their rooms, boots made by craftsmen who knew their trade. But those people were distant, almost mythical. They existed in a different world, one you glimpsed only rarely, if at all. Your world was this: cold, work, repetition, and the constant, grinding maintenance of the layers that separated you from death. You knew the name of every garment intimately. The Militsa, borrowed from the native Evenki people, was a hooded coat made from reindeer hide, worn with the fur facing inward for maximum warmth. When you could obtain or trade for one, it was treasured above almost anything else, because reindeer fur was hollow, each hair trapping air, creating insulation that was unmatched by any other natural material. The shuba, a full-length fur coat, was so expensive that you had never owned one. You had seen them, worn by visiting officials or wealthy traders, and you had marveled at their thickness, their obvious quality. Such coats were passed down through generations, becoming family heirlooms, markers of status and survival. You had your patchwork coat, your felted leggings, your straw-stuffed boots, and these were enough, barely. The mornings blurred together. You woke to the same darkness, performed the same rituals, faced the same relentless cold. Your hands developed calluses in strange places, from gripping tools through thick mittens, from endless sewing. Your shoulders ached from the weight of wet furs. Your feet, even wrapped in layers of wool and felt, were never quite warm. You learned to live with this, to accept that true warmth was something you would experience only in brief moments, huddled by the fire, lying beneath all your coverings at night, and that the rest of your existence would be spent in a state of managed cold. You learned to tell the severity of cold by subtle signs. The way frost formed on the inside walls of your dwelling indicated the outside temperature. The speed at which your breath froze in the air told you whether it was merely cold or dangerously so. The sound of the forest, or rather the absence of sound, as even birds and animals retreated into silence, warned you of the worst days. On those days, you minimized your time outside. You did only what was absolutely necessary and returned to shelter as quickly as possible, because you knew that exposure, even brief exposure, could numb extremities beyond recovery. The social dynamics of the settlement revolved partly around clothing. You noticed who had acquired new furs, who was making do with increasingly tattered garments. There was a subtle hierarchy, not acknowledged openly, but understood by all. Those with better clothing could work longer, endure more, and thus had slightly better prospects for survival. Families sometimes shared a single pair of good boots, taking turns wearing them for essential tasks. Children wore cut-down adult garments, the sleeves and legs shortened, making them look like small, bundled creatures barely distinguishable from the snow itself. Jealousy existed, though it was rarely spoken aloud. When someone returned from trading with a new coat, you felt a pang of envy, quickly suppressed, but present nonetheless. You tried not to dwell on such feelings. They accomplished nothing, changed nothing, and only made the cold seem more bitter. Better to focus on what you could control, your own repairs, your own small innovations. You learned, for instance, that placing a strip of birch bark inside your mittens created an extra layer of wind resistance. You learned that tying a belt tightly around your waist over your coat trapped warm air and prevented it from escaping through the bottom of your garments. You learned that wool, when it froze, still retained some insulating properties, while cotton, on the rare occasions you encountered it, became useless. These lessons were hard-won, learned through discomfort and near misses, and you hoarded them like precious knowledge. You passed them to your children, if you had any, in the same quiet, matter-of-fact way they had been passed to you. This was how survival knowledge moved through generations, not in books or formal instruction, but in demonstrated practice, in small tips shared during evening repairs, in the example of those who made it through winter and those who did not. The rhythm of your days became so ingrained that you could perform most tasks without conscious thought. Your hands knew how to stitch a seam, how to pack moss into boots, how to adjust a hood for maximum face coverage. Your body knew how to move through deep snow without exhausting itself, how to conserve heat, how to recognize the early signs of frostbite. This knowledge was burned into you layer upon layer, season upon season, until it became inseparable from who you were. You were a person shaped by cold, defined by the struggle against it. Your identity, if you considered such abstract things at all, was wrapped in the same practical concerns that occupied your days. Stay warm, stay alive, repair what breaks, endure what cannot be changed. There was a strange kind of peace in this simplicity, even as it ground you down. When you lay down each night, exhausted, you could at least know that you had done everything possible. You had performed the rituals, made the repairs, taken every precaution you knew. Whether it was enough was not entirely in your control. Chance and weather and fortune all played their roles. But you had done your part. And tomorrow you would wake and do it again, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as winter lasted. The cold was not cruel exactly. It was indifferent, which was perhaps worse. It did not care about your efforts, your suffering, your small victories. It simply was a constant pressure, a test you could never pass completely, but only endure. And so you endured, wrapped in your layers, moving through the white silence, a small figure in a vast landscape, kept alive by fabric and fur, and the stubborn refusal to surrender. The materials you depended on were not sophisticated. Wool came from sheep, when sheep could be kept alive through winter, sheared in spring and then carded, spun and woven by hand. The process was long and the result was imperfect. Wool thick in some places, thin in others, full of vegetable matter that had to be picked out by hand. Leather and hide came from any animal you could trap or trade for, reindeer, elk, even dogs when necessity demanded. The hides had to be scraped clean of fat and flesh, a process that took hours and left your hands raw and stinking. Then they were either tanned with birch bark or brain-tanned, rubbed with the animal's own brains mixed with water to soften the material. The result was never perfectly supple, never as fine as the leather you imagined existed in cities far away, but it served. Fur was precious. Fox, rabbit, marten, sable, if you were extraordinarily fortunate, each had its properties. Fox fur was warm but heavy. Rabbit was light but wore out quickly, especially on cuffs and hoods where it rubbed constantly. Reindeer was the gold standard, the fur that everyone sought because it was light, warm, and durable. But reindeer were not always available, and when they were, the hides commanded high prices in trade. Felt was made by layering wool, dampening it, and then beating it for hours until the fibers meshed together into a dense, nearly waterproof fabric. The work was exhausting and the result was heavy and stiff, but felt made the best boots, the best liners, the best emergency repairs. You could cut a piece of felt and sew it over a tear, and it would hold for another season. Moss and straw were gathered in autumn before the first snows and stored in whatever dry space you could find. Moss made excellent insulation. Packed into boots, it trapped air and wicked moisture away from your skin. Straw served a similar purpose and was easier to replace, though it broke down faster. Both had to be changed regularly, removed from your boots each night and dried near the fire, then packed in again the next morning. This daily ritual was time-consuming but essential. Even birch bark, thin sheets of it stripped from trees in careful spirals, found its way into your winter wardrobe. It could be layered inside boots as an emergency waterproofing or cut and shaped into crude insoles. It was stiff and uncomfortable, but it worked. And that was all that mattered. You used what was available, what the land provided, because there was no alternative. There was no store to visit, no catalogue to order from. The forest, the animals, the plants, these were your suppliers, and they were not always generous. The mittens on your hands were perhaps the most critical item you owned. Your hands were your tools, your means of work, and if they froze, everything else became impossible. So you protected them obsessively. The mittens were double-layered, inner gloves of thin, soft fur, usually rabbit, and outer mittens of felt and leather, often with the fur facing outward to shed snow. The thumbs were reinforced with extra stitching, because that was where tears most often occurred. Some mittens had no separate fingers at all, just a pouch for your hand, because separated fingers lost heat too quickly. You kept your hands moving inside the mittens, flexing, making fists, anything to keep blood flowing. You learned to do many tasks without removing them, fumbling through simple operations with heavily padded hands. Only for fine work, detailed repairs, handling sharp tools, did you dare to remove them, and then only briefly, racing against the cold that immediately began to numb your fingers. Your hood was equally vital. It extended forward, creating a tunnel that protected your face from direct wind. Often it was lined with dog fur, which did not freeze as readily as other materials, so that your breath would not turn it into a solid mass of ice. You adjusted it constantly, pulling it lower over your brow when the wind picked up, loosening it slightly when you needed better visibility. The hood became like a second face, a barrier you peered through at the world. The scarves and belts you wore were not decorative. A scarf wrapped around your lower face and neck prevented heat loss from those vulnerable areas and filtered the air you breathed, slightly warming it before it reached your lungs. Belts were tied over your outer coat, cinching it at the waist, because that was a major point of heat escape. Warm air, being lighter, rose and would pour out from the bottom of a loose coat, replaced by cold air from below. A tight belt trapped that warm air, keeping it circulated against your torso. These were the kinds of small, practical details that made the difference between relative comfort and suffering. No one had taught you these things formally. You had learned by watching, by trying, by failing and adjusting. You had learned from the mistakes of others, from seeing someone lose fingers to frostbite, and understanding exactly what they had done wrong. You had learned from the indigenous people who had lived in this landscape for generations, though often that knowledge came indirectly through imitation and adaptation rather than direct instruction. The settlers and the native populations maintained a complex relationship, sometimes trading, sometimes learning from each other, sometimes in conflict, but always aware that both were subject to the same implacable winter. The sewing you did each evening was meditative in its repetition. Thread went in and out, creating small stitches that pulled torn edges together. Your needle was a precious tool. If it broke, you would need to trade for another or attempt to make one from bone, a difficult and imperfect process. So you were careful with it, never forcing it through material that was too tough, always working with the grain of the fabric. The thread itself you had spun from wool, twisting it between your fingers or using a simple drop spindle, creating long strands that were irregular but strong. For some repairs you used sinew, the dried tendons of animals, which was incredibly strong and did not rot or freeze. Sinew had to be moistened in your mouth before use, softened just enough to be flexible, then stitched quickly before it dried again. The process was unpleasant, the taste was vile, but the results were reliable. Seams sewn with sinew lasted longer than those sewn with thread, especially in high-stress areas like the shoulders of coats or the seams of boots. You kept track of every repair, not in writing, but in your memory and in the visible history of the garment itself. This patch represented the day you tore your sleeve on a broken branch while gathering firewood. That reinforced seam was where your coat had split under the strain of carrying too heavy a load. Each mark, each alteration, was a story, a small record of survival. The garments you wore were autobiographical if anyone cared to read them, but no one did because everyone's clothing told the same basic story: hardship, repetition, endurance. There were no choices in your wardrobe, no decisions about style or color or fit. You wore what worked, what you could make or trade for, what would keep you alive. If something wore out beyond repair, you did not discard it entirely. It became scrap material, a source of patches for other garments. Nothing was wasted because everything had cost too much in time, in effort, in resources, to be thrown away lightly. Over the long winters, your body adapted in small ways. Your fingers became thicker, more calloused, better able to grip things through mittens. Your skin grew tougher, less sensitive to minor cold. Your lungs adjusted to breathing frigid air, though it never stopped causing some discomfort. These changes were incremental, almost unnoticeable from day to day, but over years they accumulated. You became, in a sense, a creature of winter, shaped by it, hardened by it. But you never became comfortable with it. Comfort was not possible. Acceptance was the best you could achieve, acceptance that this was life, that this was what survival required, and that complaining or wishing things were different accomplished nothing. So you dressed each morning in silence, layer by layer. You worked through the day with steady determination, neither hurrying nor dawdling. You repaired your clothing each evening with patient attention to detail, and you lay down each night knowing that tomorrow would be the same, and the day after and the day after that, until finally spring came and released its grip, at least for a season. But spring was far away, almost inconceivable. Winter was the only reality that mattered, and your clothing was the only shield you had against it. And so you maintained that shield with everything you had, because to let it fail would be to fail yourself, to give up the struggle, to surrender to the cold. And that you could not do, not while you still had thread and needle, not while your hands could still sew, not while breath still clouded the air before your face. The struggle continued, quiet and endless, layer after layer, stitch after stitch, one frozen morning after another. In the winter of 1793, a child was born in a settlement so small it had no official name, only a designation on a military map as Station 47 along the eastern trade route. The child was called Danil Vasilovich, son of Vasily, and his first memory, the one that would stay with him until his final days, was of cold. Not the abstract concept of cold, but the specific sensation of it, the way it crept through the gaps in the log walls of his family's dwelling, the way it made his mother's hands shake as she tried to nurse him, the way his father's breath formed clouds so thick they seemed solid in the dim morning light. Danil's father was a trapper, one of dozens who worked the forest surrounding the settlement, setting lines of snares and checking them in the darkness before dawn. Vasily was not particularly skilled at his trade, nor was he unlucky. He was simply ordinary, which on the frontier meant that survival was never guaranteed but never entirely out of reach. He caught enough to trade for grain and salt, enough to keep his small family fed through the worst months, though never enough to accumulate anything resembling wealth. The coat Vasily wore was a patchwork of rabbit and fox, sewn together over many seasons, each piece added when another wore through. Danil remembered that coat with perfect clarity, the way certain patches were dark brown while others were pale grey, the way the seams were visible as thick ridges, the way his father smelled when he returned from the trap lines, a mixture of pine sap and animal musk and frozen sweat. In Danil's fifth winter, his father did not return from the trap lines. A blizzard had come suddenly, as they sometimes did, transforming the forest from a known landscape into a white void where every direction looked identical. Vasily had likely tried to return, had probably made it part way, but somewhere in that featureless expanse he had stopped, sat down perhaps to rest, and simply not risen again. They found him 3 days later, frozen in a seated position, his trapline bag still clutched in his hand. The coat came back to the family stiff with ice, and Danil's mother had warmed it by the fire and then worn it herself, because they could not afford to waste such a garment. Danil watched her wear his father's coat through that winter, and the next, watched her shoulders barely fill it, watched the sleeves hang past her hands. He understood, even at that young age, that the coat was more important than grief, that survival demanded such practical choices. By his 8th year, Danil was wearing the coat himself. His mother had taken it apart, reworked the pieces, removed sections that were beyond repair, and added others scavenged from various sources. It no longer resembled his father's coat, but Danil knew that somewhere in its construction were pieces that Vasily had worn, and this gave him a strange comfort. He grew up thin and quiet, not sullen but reserved, speaking only when necessary. His childhood was not unhappy exactly, but it was measured by the same grinding repetitions that marked all frontier life, waking in darkness, dressing in layers, performing whatever tasks were needed, repairing what broke, enduring what could not be changed. The settlement where he lived was a collection of perhaps 30 dwellings arranged without much planning along a frozen stream. In summer, the stream ran clear and cold, full of small fish. In winter, it became a road of ice, easier to walk on than the snow-choked forest paths. The people of the settlement were a mixture of ethnic Russians, exiles sent east for minor crimes or political inconveniences, and a few indigenous families who had drifted into the settlement over the years, drawn by the possibility of trade. There was no rigid separation between groups, no formal hierarchy. Everyone was too busy surviving to maintain such structures. You worked, you traded, you helped your neighbors when you could, because you would need their help in return, and you kept your complaints to yourself because complaining changed nothing. Danil learned early to observe. He watched how different families dressed, how they prepared their clothing, how they moved through winter. He noticed that the indigenous Evenki families wore their furs differently, the hair facing inward for some garments, outward for others, depending on the specific purpose. He noticed that their boots were constructed with a different stitch pattern, one that seemed to shed water more effectively. He noticed that their children, though they owned no more than Russian children, seemed to suffer less from frostbite and cold-related illness. These observations accumulated in his mind, a quiet collection of details that he did not yet know what to do with. He was not scheming or ambitious, he was simply curious, and curiosity was one of the few luxuries that cost nothing. When Daniil was 12, his mother remarried, a practical arrangement with a widower who needed help managing his household and trap lines. The man was not unkind, but he was not warm either, and Daniil understood that his place in this new configuration was as a worker, an extra pair of hands. He accepted this without resentment. It was how things were. He took on more of the outdoor work, checking snares, hauling wood, and in the process he spent long hours in the forest, alone with his thoughts and the silent trees. The forest taught him patience. It taught him that rushing accomplished nothing, that careful attention to detail was more valuable than speed, that the difference between success and failure was often a matter of noticing small signs, a track in the snow, a broken branch, a subtle change in the wind. He applied these lessons to everything, including his clothing. When a seam tore, he did not simply stitch it closed. He examined why it had torn, whether the thread was too weak or the angle of stress too great, and he adjusted his repair accordingly. When his boots wore through, he studied the pattern of wear and reinforced the vulnerable areas before they failed. His clothing became a kind of ongoing experiment, constantly refined, constantly improved, in small increments. By 16, Daniil had begun to trade for furs on his own, using the small surplus from his stepfather's trap lines. He was not interested in wealth, not in any conventional sense. What he wanted was simple, reliable warmth. He wanted to own clothing that would not fail, that would protect him completely, that would free him from the constant anxiety of wondering whether his coat would hold together through another season. This seemed like a modest ambition, but it was surprisingly difficult to achieve. Good furs were expensive, and the labor required to construct a truly effective garment was substantial. Daniil began to spend his evenings differently than most young men in the settlement. While others gathered to drink what little alcohol was available and trade stories, Daniil sat by his fire and sewed. He practiced different stitching techniques, experimented with different materials, tried to replicate the construction methods he had observed in Evenki garments. His early attempts were failures, seams that leaked, designs that were too stiff to move in, furs that were arranged incorrectly and provided less warmth than they should have. But he kept trying because he had nothing but time and because the alternative was to accept that his clothing would always be merely adequate, never excellent. In the winter of 1809, when Daniil was 16, the settlement experienced what would later be called the winter of the empty traps. The animal populations, for reasons no one fully understood, had crashed. Trap lines that normally yielded a steady supply of rabbits and foxes came back day after day with nothing. The forest seemed emptied, as if the animals had simply vanished into the white silence. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Without furs to trade, families had no way to obtain the grain and supplies they needed from the occasional trading caravans. And without new furs, there was no material to repair or replace worn-out clothing. Garments that should have been retired continued to be worn, patched beyond reason, held together by increasingly desperate repairs. People began to ration everything: food, firewood, even the thread they used for sewing. The mood in the settlement grew tense, though the tension was quiet, unexpressed, a heavy weight that pressed down on every interaction. Daniil saw families wearing coats so patched that the original material was barely visible. He saw children with frostbitten fingers because their mittens had worn through and there was nothing to replace them with. He saw elderly people who barely left their dwellings because their clothing was inadequate, and they knew that extended exposure could kill them. It was during this winter that Daniil made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He had, through careful trading and saving, accumulated a small collection of furs, not many, but enough to make himself a truly good coat, the kind of coat he had long dreamed of owning. It would have been understandable, even expected, for him to do exactly that, to prioritize his own survival. But instead he began to give them away. Not directly, not in a way that would embarrass anyone, but by offering to repair people's clothing and incorporating his own materials into the repairs. An elderly woman whose coat had split at the shoulder seam found that when Daniil returned it, he had reinforced the entire back with a section of rabbit fur that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. A young father whose mittens were beyond saving received a new pair that Daniil claimed were extras he had made but didn't need. People knew, of course. They were not fools. But they accepted the fiction because the fiction allowed them to accept the help without feeling diminished by charity. Daniil said nothing about what he was doing. He simply continued working through the nights, his fingers cramping from the cold and the repetitive motion, his eyes straining in the poor light. It was during these long sessions that he made his breakthrough. He had traded a few small tools to an Evenki elder named Kultik in exchange for instruction on garment construction. Kultik had been reluctant at first, suspicious of Daniil's motives, but gradually had warmed to the quiet young man who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Kultik showed him the principle of directional fur, that reindeer hide worn with the hair facing inward created a warm air layer against the skin, while hair facing outward shed snow and wind. But the real innovation was combining the two. An inner layer with fur facing in, an outer layer with fur facing out, creating a double barrier that was more effective than either configuration alone. Daniil also learned about sinew stitching, about how to create seams that were not just strong but actually windproof, about how to cut and shape hides so that they moved with the body rather than restricting it. He learned about the importance of the hood design, about how a properly constructed hood created a microclimate around the face that could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. He absorbed all of this with focused intensity, and then he began to experiment. His first hybrid coat was crude, an awkward combination of Russian and Evenki techniques that didn't quite work. The proportions were wrong, the weight distribution was off, and the seams puckered in places. But it was warmer than anything he had worn before, noticeably warmer, and he knew he was onto something. He made adjustments, trying again and again, slowly refining the design. By midwinter, he had created something genuinely new, not purely Russian, not purely Evenki, but a hybrid that took the best elements of both traditions and combined them in a way that was more effective than either alone. He wore this coat while working, testing it against the brutal conditions. He noticed that he could stay out longer without discomfort, that his core temperature remained stable even on the coldest days, that the frost did not accumulate on it the way it did on traditional coats. And he began, very quietly, to make similar coats for others. The process was slow. Each coat required weeks of work, and Daniil could only work in the evenings and on days when other labor was not required. He made coats for the families who were struggling most, for people whose clothing had failed to the point of being dangerous. He charged nothing, though he accepted whatever small offerings people insisted on giving, a bit of dried fish, some candles, firewood cut and stacked. People began to talk about Daniil's coats, not loudly, not in a way that would have embarrassed him, but in quiet conversations by firesides. They talked about how so-and-so's grandfather had stopped coughing so much since getting a new coat, about how the widow Maria could now go outside to fetch water without coming back blue-lipped and shaking. They talked about how Daniil never mentioned what he was doing, never sought recognition, just continued working in his quiet, methodical way. Not everyone appreciated this. There were those who saw Daniil's integration of indigenous techniques as a kind of betrayal, a surrender of Russian identity. There were those who resented his growing influence, who felt diminished by their inability to help others in the same way. There were whispers that he was profiting somehow, that he must have hidden furs, that his modesty was false. Daniil heard these whispers and ignored them. He had no interest in defending himself, no desire to engage in the petty politics of the settlement. He simply kept working because the work itself was sufficient justification. By the time spring finally arrived, breaking winter's grip with the sudden violence that characterized Siberian seasonal changes, Daniil had made or significantly repaired the clothing of perhaps 15 families. It was not a large number in absolute terms, but in a settlement of 30 dwellings it was significant. And more importantly, those 15 families had survived a winter that might otherwise have killed some of them. No one thanked Daniil directly. That would have been awkward, would have created a debt that could not be repaid. Instead, people simply remembered. When he needed help raising a new dwelling a few years later, dozens of hands appeared. When his stepfather died and left him a small plot of cleared land, people helped him work it without being asked. The settlement had no formal economy of favor trading, but it had an informal one, and Daniil had accumulated considerable credit in that invisible ledger. As he moved into his 20s, Daniil's reputation grew beyond the settlement. Traders who passed through began to hear about the young man who made exceptional winter coats, who combined different traditions in innovative ways. Some came to him requesting coats for themselves, offering payment in goods or currency. Daniil accepted these commissions because he needed to support himself, but he never allowed them to take priority over work for his own community. His prices were modest, far below what he could have charged, because wealth remained uninteresting to him. What interested him was the work itself, the ongoing refinement of his technique, the quiet satisfaction of creating something that genuinely improved people's lives. By 30, he had developed a complete system of cold-weather clothing, not just coats, but coordinated layers, underlayers that wickered moisture away from skin, middle layers that trapped heat, outer layers that blocked wind and shed snow. He designed mittens with removable inner gloves, allowing for fine work without complete exposure. He created boot liners that could be dried and replaced daily, extending the life of the boots themselves. He developed hood designs for children that protected their faces while still allowing them to see and hear clearly. Each innovation was small, but collectively they represented a significant advance over traditional frontier clothing. The winter of isolation, as it came to be called locally, arrived when Daniil was 37. A massive blizzard system settled over the region in early November and simply did not leave. Snow fell continuously for days, then weeks. The temperature plunged to depths that even old-timers could not recall experiencing before. The settlement became completely cut off, the trails impassable, the frozen stream buried under drifts taller than a man. This was when Daniil's decades of work truly mattered. The clothing systems he had developed and shared kept people alive. Families who might have suffered catastrophic clothing failures instead found that their garments, many of which Daniil had made or repaired, held together under the extreme stress. But there were still problems. The unprecedented duration of the cold meant that even good clothing wore faster than expected. Seams stressed by constant use began to fail. Furs that should have lasted the season wore thin by mid-December. And the isolation meant there were no supplies coming in, no way to obtain new materials. Daniil found himself working 16, 18 hours a day, moving from dwelling to dwelling with his sewing kit, making emergency repairs by firelight. His fingers bled from the constant work. His eyes burned from the smoke and strain. He barely ate, barely slept, driven by a quiet desperation, not for himself, but for the community that depended on the integrity of their clothing. There were moments during that winter when he wondered if it was enough, if his efforts could actually make a difference against cold this severe. He would sit by someone's fire, repairing a coat whose owner slept nearby, and he would feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. If this coat failed, if his repair did not hold, someone might die. It was a heavy burden, made heavier by the knowledge that he had taken it on voluntarily, that no one had asked this of him. But there was also a strange peace in the work. The repetitive motion of needle through fabric, the gradual transformation of something broken into something whole, the simple act of doing what he could with what he had, these things created a kind of meditation, a quiet space where doubt could not quite reach. By the time the blizzard finally broke in late January, Daniil had repaired or reinforced clothing for virtually every family in the settlement. His own coat, by contrast, was in tatters. He had cannibalized it repeatedly, taking patches from his own garments to repair others, until what remained barely functioned. He shivered constantly that winter. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion, but he considered this an acceptable trade. When spring came and people counted their survival, several families approached Daniil's dwelling. They found him asleep by his fire, his sewing kit still in his lap, surrounded by scraps of fabric and fur. They let him sleep, and while he slept, they built him a new coat. Not one person, but a collective effort, everyone contributing a piece of fur, a section of felt, their best thread, their most careful stitching. When Daniil woke, the coat was hanging near his door, and no one would tell him who had made it. It was simply there, a gift from the community, anonymous and unconditional. Daniil wore that coat for the next 15 years. It was the finest garment he ever owned, not because of its materials, which were good, but not exceptional, but because of what it represented, the tangible expression of mutual survival, of a community that had learned to care for itself by learning to care for each other. As he aged, Daniil trained others. Not formally, not as a master with apprentices, but simply by allowing people to watch him work, by answering questions when asked, by sharing techniques freely. He was particularly patient with young people, understanding that the knowledge he had accumulated would die with him unless it was passed on. He showed them not just how to make repairs, but how to think about clothing as a system, how to anticipate problems before they became critical, how to innovate rather than simply replicate. By his 50s, Daniil's hands had become twisted with arthritis, the decades of fine work having taken their toll on his joints. His eyesight had dimmed, making detailed work difficult. He could no longer produce the precise stitching that had characterized his best work, but he continued to advise, to teach, to share what he knew with anyone who asked. He became a kind of living repository of knowledge, sought out by people from neighboring settlements who had heard of his expertise. Daniil died in his 62nd year, during a mild winter, sitting by his fire with a half-finished repair in his lap. He simply closed his eyes and did not open them again. It was a gentle death, as deaths go on the frontier, unmarked by violence or prolonged suffering. The settlement buried him in the small cemetery on the hill, and people left small offerings on his grave, scraps of fur, needles, thread, the tools of his trade. His name was not recorded in any official history. No government honored him, no chronicle mentioned his contributions. But in the settlement and the surrounding region, his name was remembered, passed down through generations not as a legend, but as a fact. Daniil Vasilovich, who made coats, who saved lives, who showed that survival was not just about enduring, but about helping others endure. His hybrid coat design continued to be made long after his death, gradually spreading through the region, becoming so common that people forgot it had ever been innovative. It simply became the way coats were made, the standard against which all others were measured. And in that forgetting was a kind of perfect success. The work had become so integrated, so natural, that it no longer needed to be attributed to anyone. It was just how things were done, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, a quiet legacy of warmth in a cold world. Daniil's life had not been dramatic. He had not conquered territory or accumulated wealth or achieved fame beyond his small corner of the world. But he had done something perhaps more meaningful. He had seen a problem, devoted himself to solving it, and in the process had made life measurably better for the people around him. His ambition had been modest: to stay warm, to help others stay warm, to make it through winter one more time. And in pursuing that modest ambition with patient dedication over decades, he had achieved something that all the wealth and fame in the world could not match. He had mattered deeply and permanently to the lives of ordinary people struggling against impossible odds. The coat, hanging in the small museum of frontier life in the region, if you could find it, would look unremarkable to modern eyes. It is patched and worn, the fur matted in places, the seams visible as thick ridges. But if you looked closely, if you understood what you were seeing, you would notice the precise angle of the stitches, the innovative layering of materials, the careful reinforcement of stress points. You would see, preserved in fabric and fur, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent in quiet service to survival. And you would understand that this coat, and the thousands like it that were made by people Daniil taught or inspired, represented something essential about human adaptation, not the grand gestures or dramatic innovations, but the patient, incremental improvements made by ordinary people doing their best with what they had. As the decades passed and the settlement grew into a small town, and the town eventually connected to the wider world through roads and telegraph lines, the conditions that had shaped Daniil's life gradually changed. Manufactured clothing became available, shipped in from distant factories. Winter, while still harsh, became less immediately life-threatening as technology advanced and infrastructure improved. The specific skills Daniil had developed became less essential, relegated eventually to historical curiosity. But the principle remained that survival in harsh conditions required not just toughness, but thoughtfulness, not just endurance, but innovation, not just individual strength, but community cooperation. Daniil had embodied these principles without ever articulating them, had lived them so thoroughly that they became inseparable from his identity. And in doing so, he had left a mark far deeper than fame, far more lasting than wealth, a mark written in the lives saved, the cold endured, the mornings faced with adequate clothing and therefore adequate hope. His story, told here in quiet tones as you drift towards sleep, is not meant to inspire dramatic action or grand ambitions. It is meant simply to remind you that significance often lies in small acts repeated patiently over time, that the most profound human achievements are sometimes the ones no one writes about, and that in the end, the measure of a life well lived might simply be whether others were warmer because you existed. Let his memory rest gently in your mind as we move forward into other explorations, other quiet corners of history where ordinary people did extraordinary things simply by refusing to give up, by learning from those around them, and by caring enough to share what they learned with anyone who needed it. In the archives of a regional museum in eastern Siberia, there exists a collection that few people ever see. It consists of perhaps 24 garments recovered over the past century from various archaeological sites, abandoned settlements, collapsed dwellings, burial sites that erosion or construction accidentally exposed. These pieces are fragile now, preserved as well as modern conservation methods allow, but still slowly disintegrating despite the careful climate control and protective storage. What makes this collection remarkable is not the garments themselves, which at first glance appear unremarkable, but the questions they raise, questions that remain, even after decades of study, largely unanswered. The museum building itself is modest, a converted administrative structure from the Soviet era, its hallways lined with photographs of expeditions and maps marking archaeological sites. The storage room where the garments rest is maintained at a constant temperature just above freezing, with humidity levels monitored hourly and adjusted by machines that hum softly in the background, a mechanical lullaby for artifacts that have already slept for centuries. The first puzzle concerns the underground storage pits. In 17 locations across the region, archaeologists have discovered carefully constructed pits, dug deep into the permafrost, lined with birch bark, and sealed with layers of moss and clay. Inside these pits, wrapped in more bark and occasionally in what appears to be oiled leather, were bundles of fur fragments, not complete garments, but pieces, some as small as a hand, others as large as a cloak. The condition of these fragments varies wildly. Some are pristine, the fur still supple, the leather backing still flexible, as though they were placed there only months ago rather than generations past. Others are degraded beyond recognition, crumbling to dust when exposed to air and light, their molecular structure so compromised by time that they can barely hold their shape long enough to be photographed and catalogued. What unites them is their deliberate placement, the careful wrapping, the obvious intention to preserve them for future use, or perhaps for some purpose we can no longer understand. The question, soft and unanswerable, hangs over the collection: why bury clothing in permafrost? The practical explanation is storage, that these were valuable materials being preserved against decay, kept frozen until needed. But this explanation, while logical, does not quite satisfy. The pits required significant labor to excavate, especially in frozen ground where summer thaws penetrated only the uppermost layers, leaving the deeper earth locked in ice that resisted picks and shovels with stubborn permanence. The wrapping and sealing process was meticulous, time-consuming, suggesting these were not simple storage but something more ceremonial, more intentional. Some researchers have proposed that the pits were emergency caches, supplies hidden against the possibility of catastrophic need. A fire that destroyed a settlement, a particularly brutal winter that exhausted all other resources, a sudden displacement that forced communities to flee. Others suggest they were burial goods meant to accompany the dead into whatever afterlife the people believed in, though no human remains have been found in direct association with the pits. Still others point to the possibility of trade goods, furs prepared for eventual exchange but never retrieved for unknown reasons, the trader who died en route, the route that became too dangerous to travel, the market that collapsed before the transaction could occur. Each theory has merit and each fails to fully explain the evidence. The distribution of the pits is itself curious, scattered across hundreds of kilometers with no apparent pattern, some clustered near river crossings, others isolated in forests far from any known settlement. The effort required to create them suggests they were important, yet their concealment suggests they were also secret, or at least private, not meant for common knowledge or casual access. In one location, archaeologists found 3 pits within a few meters of each other, all containing similar materials but sealed at different times. The birch bark in each showed different degrees of deterioration, suggesting decades between deposits. This implies that someone returned to this specific spot repeatedly across a lifetime, or that knowledge of the location was passed down through generations, each adding to the hidden store for reasons that died with them. The mystery deepens when one examines the needles found in many frontier sites. They are made from bone, bird bone usually, which is both light and strong, and they are carved with extraordinary care. The eyes are perfectly round, drilled with a precision that seems impossible given the tools available, each one so smooth and regular that it suggests hours of patient work, rotating a thin drill bit carved from harder bone or perhaps stone, gradually enlarging the hole while keeping it perfectly circular. But more intriguing are the decorations. Many needles bear spiral patterns carved into their surfaces, tiny grooves that wind from the point to the eye in regular intervals. These spirals serve no obvious practical function. They do not improve the needle's performance, do not make it easier to grip or to thread, and in fact might slightly weaken the needle by creating stress points in the bone. Yet they appear again and again across different sites, across different time periods, consistent enough to suggest they were meaningful, but varied enough to suggest they were not mass-produced. Some needles have dot patterns instead of spirals, small circular indentations arranged in rows or clusters, their spacing precise as though measured against some invisible grid. Some have cross-hatching, some have lines that radiate from the eye, like a sun. The variety is fascinating, but so is the underlying consistency. Almost every needle found in a frontier settlement context bears some kind of decoration, ranging from simple scratched lines to elaborate geometric patterns that must have taken days to complete. Modern needles, by contrast, are purely functional, unmarked, anonymous, manufactured by the thousands with no thought given to individual identity or aesthetic consideration. The decorated needles suggest that sewing, or perhaps the tools of sewing, carried significance beyond mere utility. Were the spirals protective symbols meant to ward off bad luck or invoke good fortune for the person using them or for the garments they created? Were they markers of ownership, identifying which needle belonged to which person in a communal living situation where personal property might be limited and tools were precious enough to track carefully? Were they simply artistic expression, the small pleasure of making something beautiful in a world that was often harsh and utilitarian, where opportunities for creativity were constrained by the demands of survival? We cannot know. The people who carved these needles left no written records explaining their choices, and the oral traditions that might have preserved the knowledge have long since faded, disrupted by population movements, cultural changes, the arrival of new belief systems that displaced older ones, and the simple erosion of memory across generations. What remains are the objects themselves, beautiful and enigmatic, whispering across centuries in a language we can no longer quite understand, their surfaces worn smooth by hands we will never know, their purposes partially visible but never fully revealed. Some needles show clear signs of long use, the bone polished by friction, the points worn blunt and resharpened multiple times, creating a slight curve to the shaft that speaks of years of threading and pulling through tough materials. These were valued possessions kept and maintained across lifetimes, perhaps passed from parent to child, each generation adding their own microscopic contribution to the patina of use. Other needles appear nearly unused, their decorations still crisp and sharp, suggesting they were special objects, kept for particular purposes or perhaps never actually employed for sewing, but held for symbolic reasons we cannot access. Another oddity appears in the fabric analysis of recovered garments. Modern microscopy and chemical testing have revealed that many pieces contain layers of soot and grease embedded deep within the fibers, not on the surface, where one would expect from normal wear, but integrated throughout the material. This suggests the fabrics were deliberately treated, repeatedly exposed to smoke and fat in a systematic way, hung above fires for extended periods, or laid out and rubbed with rendered fat until the material was saturated. The practical benefits of such treatment are clear enough. Smoke contains compounds that repel insects and inhibit mold, extending the life of organic materials that would otherwise become food for beetles or substrate for fungal growth in the damp conditions that could occur during brief summer thaws. Grease waterproofs fabric and keeps leather supple, preventing the brittleness that extreme cold can induce in untreated materials. But the degree of impregnation found in these garments goes beyond what would result from incidental exposure or simple maintenance performed occasionally as needed. These textiles were soaked repeatedly in smoke and fat until they became almost rigid with it, their fibers swollen and darkened, their original colors obscured beneath layers of treatment that transformed their very nature. The process would have been deliberate, time-consuming, requiring fires maintained at specific temperatures for hours or days, fat carefully collected and melted and applied in multiple sessions, and would have given the garments a strong, distinctive smell, not unpleasant necessarily, but pronounced, a mixture of wood smoke and rendered animal fat that would have clung to the wearer and announced their presence before they came into view. This smell would have been intimate and constant, a personal atmosphere that followed each person through their days, as distinctive as appearance or voice. Was this purely practical, a preservation technique that also happened to improve the garment's weather resistance to levels necessary for surviving extended periods in extreme conditions? Or was there a symbolic component, a belief that smoke carried protective properties beyond its chemical effects, that fat held some essential quality that transferred to the fabric and by extension to the person wearing it? In several indigenous Siberian traditions, smoke was considered purifying, capable of driving away evil spirits or bad luck, its upward movement seen as carrying prayers or intentions toward the sky, toward the realm of powerful forces that governed fortune. Fat derived from animals might have been seen as containing the animal's strength or warmth, its essence captured in the rendered substance and available to be transferred through proximity and absorption. But these are speculations, extrapolations from related cultures observed in later periods or in different regions, not direct evidence from the people who actually performed these treatments. The settlers who treated their garments this way left no explanation, and we are left to wonder about the boundary between practical necessity and spiritual belief, about where function ended and ritual began, about whether such distinctions even existed in minds shaped by different assumptions about how the world worked. The chemical signatures in the treated fabrics show interesting variations. Some were exposed primarily to birch smoke, others to pine, others to a mixture that might indicate different seasons or availability of wood types. The fats similarly vary, some clearly from seal or other marine mammals, others from land animals like reindeer or elk, suggesting either regional differences based on available resources or perhaps deliberate choices based on believed properties of different animal fats. Perhaps the most mysterious finds are the oversized mittens. In 3 separate excavations, archaeologists have recovered mittens that are, by any reasonable standard, too large to be functional. They are massive, 3 or 4 times the size of a normal hand, constructed with the same careful stitching as regular mittens, but clearly not intended for actual wear by any human proportions known to anatomy. Some have proposed these were decorative items meant for display rather than use, perhaps hung in dwellings as symbols of warmth or protection, their exaggerated size making them more visible and impressive. Others suggest they were training pieces made by apprentices learning the craft before attempting properly sized garments, the larger scale allowing for easier manipulation and clearer visibility of techniques being practiced. But neither explanation quite fits the evidence. The mittens are found in dwelling contexts, not in ceremonial spaces or teaching areas, mixed in with normal household items rather than set apart as special objects would be. They show signs of wear, scuffing on the palms, stress on the seams, suggesting they were handled, possibly used in some way we don't understand, their surfaces bearing the marks of friction and pressure that come only from actual employment rather than passive storage. One theory, tentative and unprovable, is that they were used in winter festivals or rituals, perhaps worn over normal mittens, as part of a costume or ceremony, their absurd proportions creating a comic or impressive effect depending on the context. Winters on the frontier were not only physically brutal but psychologically challenging, the endless darkness and confinement of the cold season creating conditions where social cohesion could fray and individual spirits could break under the weight of monotony and isolation. It would make sense that people developed social rituals to break the monotony, to create moments of community and celebration that provided psychological relief as necessary as physical shelter. Large, exaggerated mittens might have been comic props, used in performances or games to lighten the mood, their unwieldy size creating laughter through absurdity, the kind of humor that binds communities together through shared amusement at the ridiculous. Or they might have had practical applications we haven't considered, perhaps as protective covers for some tool or object that needed to be transported or stored, perhaps as containers for transporting delicate items in extreme cold, their thick padding and sealed construction providing insulation for fragile goods. One mitten shows interior staining consistent with plant materials, suggesting it might have held seeds or dried herbs, though why these would need such elaborate protection remains unclear. The truth is, we don't know, and the mittens remain curiosities, stored carefully in museum drawers, resisting all attempts at definitive interpretation, their bulk and careful construction standing as testament to effort whose purpose has evaporated into time. Each time a curator shows them to a visitor, the same questions arise, the same speculations are offered, and the same uncertainty remains, the objects stubbornly refusing to yield their secrets despite all scrutiny. The influence of indigenous techniques on settler clothing is well documented but imperfectly understood. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of cross-cultural exchange, Russian-style coats with Evenki-style hood constructions, traditional felt boots with indigenous-style fur liners, hybrid garments that combine elements from both traditions in ways that suggest experimentation and adaptation rather than simple copying. But the details of this exchange remain murky, filtered through incomplete records and the physical evidence that shows results without revealing processes. Did settlers learn by direct instruction, sitting with indigenous craftspeople, and being taught techniques explicitly, relationships formed through trade or marriage or simple proximity that allowed knowledge to pass from one group to another? Did they learn by observation, examining garments and attempting to reproduce what they saw, reverse engineering solutions to problems they shared despite cultural differences? Was there resistance to this borrowing, social tension around the adoption of foreign methods, pride that chafed at the implicit admission that others had superior knowledge, or skepticism about whether techniques developed in one context would translate to another? Or was it simply pragmatic? A recognition that some techniques worked better in these conditions and that survival trumped cultural pride, that when cold could kill, questions of tradition became secondary to questions of effectiveness. The historical record gives us hints but not answers. There are mentions in traders' journals of settlers seeking advice from native populations about cold weather clothing, brief notes recording exchanges where furs or tools changed hands along with information. There are references to indigenous women being hired or trading their skills for goods, working in settler households or taking commissioned pieces to complete, their expertise valued even if the broader power dynamics remained unequal and exploitative. But these are fragments, brief notes in documents focused on other matters, trade tallies, travel routes, political maneuverings, not detailed ethnographic accounts that might capture the human texture of these interactions. We know the exchange happened. The physical evidence in the garments themselves proves that, the stitching patterns and material choices showing clear influence across cultural boundaries. But the human dimension of it, the negotiations and relationships and possibly conflicts that shaped it, remains largely invisible, occurring in spaces and moments that no one thought to document because they seemed too ordinary, too peripheral to the events considered important by those keeping records. We can see that a Russian coat has an Evenki-style hood, but we cannot see the conversation that led to that modification, cannot hear the explanation given, or the questions asked cannot know whether this was a moment of mutual respect or a transaction colored by inequality and need. The Evenki Milica design, with its hood and its careful attention to directional fur placement that ensured water would run off rather than penetrate, appears repeatedly in modified forms throughout frontier settlements, but each community seems to have adapted it slightly differently. Some versions have longer hems, extending protection further down the body at the cost of mobility and material. Some have additional closures at the waist, allowing the wearer to seal the garment more tightly or to open it for ventilation as conditions changed. Some incorporate felt panels in areas where the original used only fur, perhaps because felt was more readily available or because experience showed it performed better in specific conditions. This variation suggests that the design was not simply copied wholesale, but was understood, analyzed, and intentionally modified to suit different needs or preferences or available materials. That process of understanding and modification implies a sophisticated engagement with the technology, not just mindless imitation, but thoughtful innovation, people taking an idea and making it their own through deliberate changes that reflected their own circumstances and insights. It suggests that at least some settlers approached indigenous knowledge with respect, recognizing expertise when they encountered it and seeking to learn genuinely rather than to exploit, seeing these techniques as valuable knowledge rather than inferior alternatives to be dismissed or appropriated without acknowledgement. But again, we are reading between the lines, inferring relationships from objects, trying to reconstruct human dynamics from stitching patterns and material choices, building castles of interpretation on foundations of physical evidence that cannot speak directly to questions of motivation and meaning. The garments themselves are silent on the social contexts of their creation, neutral witnesses that show what was done but not why or by whom, or with what thoughts and feelings accompanying the work. The archaeological technique called wind sealing is perhaps the most debated mystery in the collection. In approximately 40% of recovered garments, researchers have identified a distinctive seam construction that appears nowhere in contemporary Russian or indigenous traditions as they are currently understood, either a local innovation or a technique whose origins have been lost in both source cultures. The seams are cross-stitched in a way that creates overlapping layers of thread, forming a kind of interlocking barrier that increases material density at the join. When examined under magnification, the structure resembles scales or roof shingles, each section of thread overlapping the previous one in a pattern that repeats with remarkable consistency across the length of the seam. The theoretical benefit of such construction would be exceptional wind resistance. Air attempting to penetrate the seam would be deflected by the overlapping layers, unable to find a straight path through the fabric, forced to navigate a maze of obstacles that would slow and eventually stop its progress. But creating these seams requires extraordinary time and precision. Each stitch must be placed exactly following a complex pattern that requires complete attention to maintain the thread entering and exiting at specific angles relative to previous stitches. The tension must be perfectly consistent throughout, tight enough to create the overlapping effect, but not so tight as to pucker the fabric or create stress points that might tear. And the thread must be of uniform thickness throughout, requiring careful preparation and selection, since any variation would disrupt the regularity needed for the technique to function properly. A single seam in a coat might take 10 or 12 hours to complete, compared to 2 or 3 hours for a standard seam using simpler techniques that would provide adequate, if not exceptional, protection. The question is whether this technique actually provided meaningful benefits, or whether it was based on mistaken beliefs about how wind and cold penetrate clothing, an elaborate solution to a misunderstood problem. Modern textile science suggests that the wind resistance would indeed be improved, laboratory testing showing measurably reduced air penetration compared to control seams, though whether the improvement justified the massive increase in labor time is debatable. and likely depended on specific circumstances. For someone making a single coat to last year's, the investment might be worthwhile, while for someone needing to produce multiple garments quickly, simpler methods would be more practical. But there's another possibility, one that researchers mention hesitantly, aware of how speculative it sounds and how difficult it is to prove or disprove. Perhaps these seams were not primarily functional, but symbolic, their complexity and the time they required being the point, rather than the physical properties they produced. Perhaps the time invested in their creation was itself the point, a physical manifestation of care and protection that transcended mere material considerations. If you spent 12 hours stitching a seam for your child's coat, might that garment carry in your mind a kind of protective power that a hastily made garment lacked, the accumulated hours of focused attention creating something beyond fabric and thread? Might the belief that the garment was special translate, psychologically, into being more careful with it, maintaining it better, repairing it more promptly, and therefore actually making it last longer and protect better through the indirect mechanism of increased care? We move here into territory where archaeology and psychology intersect, where the physical evidence leads us toward questions about belief and intention that cannot be answered with scientific certainty. The seams exist, their construction is documented, but their meaning remains forever ambiguous, suspended between the material and the interpretive, between what we can measure and what we can only imagine. The colored threads present another enigma. In a handful of garments, bright red and blue threads appear in small amounts, sometimes as a single stitch, sometimes as a short line of stitches, sometimes woven into a seam in complex patterns that create small geometric shapes or abstract designs. These threads are dyed, not natural, and the dyes would have been expensive, difficult to obtain on the frontier where most materials had to be locally sourced or carried at great effort across vast distances. The fact that they appear at all suggests they were valued, considered worth the cost, important enough that someone made the effort to acquire them and the decision to use them in these specific ways. But why include them in utilitarian winter garments, where they would often be hidden under other layers, rarely visible to anyone except the wearer or those who helped them dress? The patterns they form do not seem to be decorative in the usual sense. They are too small, too irregularly placed, not situated where they would catch the eye or contribute to an overall aesthetic effect. Some researchers have proposed they marked repairs, a way of tracking which seams had been reinforced or replaced, a visual record of the garment's history built into its structure. Others suggest they indicated ownership or family affiliation, like a kind of subtle signature woven into the fabric, visible to those who knew to look but not obvious to casual observers. Still others see ritual significance, colors chosen for symbolic meaning, red for warmth or blood or life, blue for sky or water or protection, each color carrying associations that gave the thread meaning beyond its physical properties. Indigenous Siberian cultures did use colors symbolically in their crafts, with each hue carrying layered meanings related to cosmology and belief systems, the visible spectrum mapped onto spiritual categories in ways that made color choices significant acts rather than merely aesthetic ones. If settlers borrowed these symbolic associations along with practical techniques, the colored threads might represent an attempt to invoke protection or blessing through the garment itself, to embed within its structure not just material durability, but spiritual fortification, the color becoming a carrier of intention, a physical marker of hope or prayer, woven permanently into fabric that would rest against skin and travel through dangerous cold. But as with so much else, this remains speculation. The threads are there, their presence undeniable, small bright lines visible against the darker materials surrounding them, but their meaning has dissolved into time, leaving only the physical trace and our endless wondering. Chemical analysis can tell us what plants created the dyes, can trace possible trade routes or sources, but it cannot tell us what the person who placed those stitches was thinking, what significance the color held for them, whether this was ritual or repair or simple aesthetic pleasure in adding a spot of brightness to a dark world. There are documented rituals around garments, though the documentation is frustratingly sparse. A missionary's journal from the early 1800s mentions, almost in passing, a blessing ceremony held at the onset of winter, where families brought newly made or repaired coats to be blessed by the village elder, gathering in the largest dwelling available while the first serious cold descended outside. The entry is brief, just a few sentences embedded in a longer account of the missionary's travels and attempts at conversion, and his tone is dismissive. He clearly considered this a pagan superstition unworthy of serious attention, barely worth recording except as evidence of the spiritual darkness he saw himself combating. But he does note that the elder spoke words over each garment and touched them with a burning brand from the communal fire, leaving small scorch marks on the fabric, the smoke rising in thin streams that dissipated against the ceiling. Were these scorch marks protective symbols, physical marks of blessing meant to imbue the garment with spiritual protection, connecting it to the fire that represented warmth and life and the community's collective survival? Several preserved garments do show small, deliberate burn marks, circular and clean-edged, not the kind of damage that would result from accidental contact with flame, their placement too consistent and careful to be random. The marks are usually on the inside of the collar or near the heart, places where they would rest against the wearer's body but would not be visible to others, suggesting their significance was personal and internal rather than social and displayed. These hidden marks speak to beliefs about how protection worked, whether it operated through visible signs meant to impress others or through invisible connections between object and wearer, power that functioned regardless of external observation. Another fragmentary account, this one from a trader's memoirs published decades after his experiences and therefore potentially colored by time and selective memory, describes seeing children's boots hung near smoke holes at the beginning of winter. When he asked about this practice, he was told it was to feed the warmth spirits, though his informant seemed reluctant to elaborate, perhaps aware that the trader might mock the belief, or perhaps constrained by cultural rules about sharing such information with outsiders. The concept of warmth spirits, entities or forces associated with heat and protection from cold, beings that might need to be acknowledged or appeased to maintain their benevolence, appears in various indigenous Siberian traditions, their specific characteristics varying by culture, but the underlying concept recurring across wide geographical and cultural ranges. If settlers had adopted or adapted these beliefs, it would represent a profound cultural borrowing, not just of practical techniques, but of worldview, of fundamental assumptions about how the world worked and what forces governed fortune and survival. But again, we have only hints, passing mentions in documents written by people who were not particularly interested in understanding what they were seeing, who recorded these observations as curiosities or evidence of superstition rather than as data worthy of careful collection and analysis. The boots hanging in the smoke, were they being treated for preservation, receiving the same smoke saturation that other garments underwent? Or was this, specifically ritual, a distinct act separated from practical maintenance by intention and belief? One of the most poignant finds is a child's coat recovered from a collapsed dwelling that bears a distinctive pattern of stitching around the hem. Small, repetitive marks that form no obvious design, but that cover the entire lower edge of the garment in a band perhaps 2 fingers wide. Analysis suggests these were made by multiple people, the stitching styles slightly different, the tension and angle varying in ways that indicate different hands worked on different sections, though all followed the same basic pattern. It appears that several individuals, perhaps family members or community members, each contributed a section of stitching to this garment, taking turns adding their work to a shared project. The practical purpose is unclear. The stitching does not reinforce a weak area or repair damage, appears to add nothing structural or functional to the coat's performance. It seems purely decorative or perhaps symbolic, each set of stitches representing something beyond their physical presence. One interpretation is that this was a garment made communally, with each person's stitches representing their wish for the child's safety and warmth, their contribution both practical and ceremonial, labor that was simultaneously functional work and prayer. In a world where infant and child mortality was high, where winter cold was a genuine threat to small bodies with less ability to regulate temperature and less body mass to generate and retain heat, such a garment might have carried profound meaning, a physical embodiment of community protection, every stitch a prayer or hope stitched literally into the fabric that would wrap around the child's body. But this is interpretation, emotion projected backward onto an object that cannot speak for itself, our own feelings about childhood vulnerability and community care shaping how we read the evidence. We see the stitches, we can analyze the different techniques used, can measure the variations that indicate multiple contributors, but we cannot know what the people who made them were thinking or feeling, what words they might have spoken as they worked, what beliefs gave meaning to their actions, whether they saw this as ritual or as simple cooperative labor, whether each stitch carried conscious intention or was simply part of the communal effort to clothe a community member. The coat is small enough that the child who wore it could not have been more than 4 or 5 years old, and its presence in a collapsed dwelling suggests that either the child outgrew it and it was set aside, or that something sadder occurred, an outcome that the community's stitched hopes could not prevent. There are whispered traditions, passed down orally in some communities, about songs sung while working leather. The leather, especially thick hide from elk or reindeer, required extensive processing before it could be sewn, transforming raw material into something workable through labor that was physically demanding and time-intensive. It had to be softened, a process that involved scraping away the fat and meat clinging to the inner surface, treating with brains or fat that acted as tanning agents through chemical processes not understood but empirically verified, and then working it, pulling and stretching and rubbing for hours until it became pliable, the stiff hide gradually relaxing into flexibility. This work was physically demanding and mentally numbing in its repetition, the same motions performed thousands of times, and oral traditions suggest that people sang while doing it, both to mark time and maintain rhythm, and possibly for some other reason that the songs themselves might hint at. The few fragments of these songs that have been recorded by ethnographers are rhythmic, repetitive, with nonsense syllables alternating with occasional words that refer to warmth, protection, or the animal the hide came from, phrases that might be invocations or might simply be mnemonic devices or might once have had meaning that has since been lost or obscured. Were these work songs simple aids to maintaining rhythm during monotonous labor, the human voice creating structure and pattern to make time pass more bearably? Or were they closer to incantations, attempts to address the spirit of the animal, to thank it for its hide, or to ask that the hide serve its new purpose well, relationships between human and animal that continued past death and required acknowledgement? In animistic belief systems which were common among indigenous Siberian peoples and which may have influenced frontier settlers more than official records acknowledge, animals possessed spirits that deserved respect, and taking an animal's life or using its body carried obligations that responsible people honored. Using an animal's hide without proper acknowledgement might invite misfortune, disrupting the balance between humans and the natural world in ways that could have consequences extending beyond the immediate act. Singing to the hide as you worked, it could be seen as a way of maintaining right relationship, of ensuring that the garment made from that hide would function as it should, the animal's spirit appeased or honored or simply acknowledged in ways that seemed necessary and appropriate, even if the exact mechanics of causation remained mysterious. But these are suppositions built on fragments of fragments, songs half remembered by people 2 or 3 generations removed from those who originally sang them, meanings that may have already been lost before anyone thought to write them down or record them, the erosion of knowledge accelerating as old ways gave way to new, and the context that made certain practices meaningful disappeared. The recordings we have are scratchy, the voices often elderly and uncertain, sometimes stopping mid-verse because they cannot remember the next line, sometimes continuing with obvious improvisations because the original has slipped away. The ambiguous line between practical and sacred runs through all of this. Modern Western culture tends to draw sharp distinctions between functional objects and ritual objects, between work and worship, categories kept separate through philosophical frameworks that treat the material and spiritual as fundamentally different domains. But frontier life, especially in conditions as harsh as Siberian winter, may not have permitted such clear categories, or may have operated under different assumptions where those boundaries did not exist or were drawn differently. When your clothing was literally the difference between life and death, when adequate garments meant survival and inadequate ones meant freezing, when the success of your repairs determined whether your child survived the season or succumbed to cold that seeped through weak seams, the act of making and maintaining that clothing naturally took on profound significance that transcended simple utility. Every stitch was both mechanical and meaningful, thread pulled through fabric in accordance with practical technique, but also as an act that carried weight beyond its physical result. Every material choice was both practical and possibly symbolic, selection based on availability and performance, but perhaps also on believed properties that went beyond what could be measured or tested. The garment protected your body from cold, yes, performing its function through the physical properties of insulation and wind resistance, but perhaps it also protected your spirit from despair, your sense of self from the crushing weight of hardship that could break people as surely as cold could kill them. When you wrapped yourself in furs you had tanned, sewn with thread you had spun, reinforced with stitches you had carefully placed, you were not just putting on clothing, you were putting on your own labor, your own skill, your own refusal to surrender to impossible circumstances, wearing your competence and determination as literally as you wore fabric and fur. And if in addition to those tangible qualities, you believed the garment also carried blessings or protection derived from the materials themselves, from the spirits of the animals who provided them, from the songs sung over them, or the prayers stitched into them, did that belief make the garment more effective? Not physically, perhaps, not in ways that would show up in laboratory testing of insulation values or wind resistance, but psychologically, emotionally, in ways that might translate into better care, longer use, greater resilience in the face of hardship that was as much mental as physical. There is no scientific way to measure such things, no experiment that could separate the material from the spiritual effects, no control group that could isolate belief as a variable. We are left only with the objects, with their mysteries, with our questions that spiral out into uncertainty like the decorative patterns carved into bone needles, leading nowhere we can definitively follow, but creating beautiful shapes in the process of going nowhere at all. In a storage room at the museum, there is a display that is rarely shown to the public. It contains what might be called the collection's greatest mystery, a complete garment, a full-length coat that defies easy classification and challenges every attempt at straightforward interpretation. It appears to be constructed from dozens, perhaps hundreds, of small pieces of different furs, each piece no larger than a playing card, all sewn together in an intricate patchwork that creates swirling patterns of color and texture. The work required to create such a garment would have been immense, representing perhaps months of careful labor if done properly. Each small piece had to be cut precisely, each edge aligned and stitched to its neighbors with meticulous care to ensure the seams did not create weak points where cold could penetrate or where the stress of wear would cause separation. The result is beautiful in a strange way, a coat of many colors and textures, light catching each fur differently, so that the surface seems to shimmer and shift as viewing angle changes. Some patches dark and absorptive, others light and reflective, the overall effect more complex and visually interesting than any single fur garment could be. But the practical value is questionable at best. All those seams would be potential failure points, places where cold could penetrate if the stitching loosened, or where tears could begin if the fabric caught on something, structural weaknesses multiplied by the number of joins. A simpler design using larger pieces, or ideally single pieces, would have been stronger, more durable, and would have taken far less time to construct, the same amount of fur transformed into a garment in a fraction of the hours. So why was this made? The label beside it in the storage room suggests it might have been ceremonial, perhaps worn by a community leader during important gatherings, its elaborate construction marking it as special, set apart from everyday garments through the obvious investment of time and skill required. But there is evidence of wear. The cuffs are slightly abraded, the hem shows contact with ground and snow, the collar bears stains consistent with long-term contact with skin and hair. Someone wore this regularly, used it as functional clothing, despite the impracticality of its construction, despite the constant risk that one of those many seams might fail at a critical moment. Another theory is that it was a necessity piece, made during a time when large furs were unavailable and someone had to work with scraps, with small remnants salvaged from damaged garments or left over from other projects. Survival demanding that every bit of material be utilized regardless of aesthetic considerations. But if that were the case, one would expect a cruder construction, a focus on function over form, seams that were adequate but not beautiful, stitching that prioritized speed and strength over precision and appearance. This coat, whatever its origin, represents careful artistry, time invested not just in making something functional, but in making something beautiful, attention paid to how the colors and textures played against each other, creating patterns that please the eye, even as they fulfill practical needs. Perhaps that is the answer, that someone, for reasons we can no longer access, chose to create beauty in the midst of hardship, to make something that was both useful and aesthetic, practical and meaningful, refusing to treat survival as purely mechanical. Perhaps in a life constrained by cold and scarcity and endless repetition, the act of creating something genuinely beautiful was itself a form of resistance, a statement that life was more than mere survival, that humans deserved beauty even in desperate circumstances, that the spirit needed nourishment as much as the body needed warmth. Or perhaps we are reading too much into it, projecting modern romantic notions onto a practical object whose true purpose was mundane and obvious to its maker, but has simply been lost to time, the context that would explain everything having evaporated while the object endured. The frustration of archaeology is precisely this. We have the objects but not the context, the physical evidence but not the human stories that gave that evidence meaning, the end result but not the process, the answer but not the question. We can measure and analyze and theorize, applying every tool modern science offers, but we cannot ask the people who made these things what they were thinking, what their choices meant to them, what beliefs or needs or desires shaped their actions, what they would say if they could see us puzzling over their work centuries later. And so we are left with mysteries, with objects that whisper across the centuries but never quite speak clearly enough to be fully understood, their meanings forever partial, forever filtered through our own assumptions and limitations. The museum's collection includes several children's garments beyond the communally stitched coat, and these raise their own questions about childhood on the frontier. The pieces are scaled-down versions of adult clothing, constructed with the same techniques but sized for small bodies, evidence that children were dressed with the same care and attention as adults, their survival equally dependent on adequate protection. Some show modifications specific to childhood needs, reinforced knees for crawling or play, extra length in sleeves and hems, suggesting they were made to be grown into rather than replaced constantly as children grew. One tiny coat, sized for an infant, has fur turned inward on all surfaces, creating an environment of complete softness against delicate skin, insulation without roughness, warmth without irritation. The labor required to construct this, reversing the normal orientation and dealing with the technical challenges that creates, speaks to concern for the smallest and most vulnerable, effort invested in comfort beyond mere survival. These garments, more than perhaps any other items in the collection, carry emotional weight for modern viewers, reminding us that behind the archaeological abstractions were real children, individuals who played and grew, and whose parents made clothing for them with whatever combination of skill and love and desperation circumstances allowed. Among the less mysterious but still notable findings are the repair patterns visible in many garments. Examination under magnification reveals that most pieces were repaired multiple times, patches added, and seams reinforced and weak areas rebuilt, the garments maintained and extended beyond their original lifespan through continuous intervention. Some patches are careful and well integrated, barely distinguishable from the original construction, while others are crude and obvious, suggesting emergency repairs done quickly when damage occurred at inopportune times. The variety of repair materials is striking. Some patches are clearly original material, carefully saved scraps used to fix damage in matching fashion, while others are improvised, whatever was available pressed into service regardless of perfect suitability. One coat shows 7 distinct repair episodes, each using different materials and techniques. Its surface a kind of archaeological record of its own history, each intervention visible as a layer in the garment's biography. This pattern of continuous repair reflects material scarcity, the difficulty of replacing garments making maintenance crucial, every piece kept functional as long as possible through whatever means available. It also reflects skill, the knowledge needed to assess damage and implement fixes that would hold, technical competence that prevented small problems from becoming catastrophic failures. But perhaps it also reflects something else, an attachment to specific objects, a reluctance to discard something that had served well, a relationship between person and garment that made replacement feel wrong, even when possible, the familiar coat preferred over the new one despite objective inferiority. The museum's conservation efforts face ongoing challenges. Despite controlled environments, the garments continue to deteriorate, organic materials breaking down through processes that can be slowed but not stopped, time claiming its due, no matter how carefully we try to preserve. Each time a curator handles a garment for study or display, tiny amounts of material are lost, fibers detaching and falling away. The act of observation itself destructive in small increments. Photography captures details before they disappear. Three-dimensional scanning creates digital records that will outlast the physical objects, but these are substitutes, information about the thing rather than the thing itself. The tension between preservation and access troubles museum staff. These objects have information to share, details that might answer questions or raise new ones, but examination hastens their destruction, each revelation purchased at the cost of the object's integrity. Some pieces are too fragile for any handling, stored in sealed containers under inert gas, their survival prioritized over their study, mysteries literally locked away to prevent their complete loss. The museum director speaks of the collection with a mixture of pride and melancholy, aware that she oversees objects that are simultaneously precious and doomed, their slow dissolution inevitable despite her best efforts. She describes the surreal experience of cataloguing losses, documenting each season's deterioration, watching garments she has cared for years gradually fade toward nothing, fragments that survived centuries in permafrost now failing in her careful keeping because no environment she can create matches the accidental preservation of frozen ground. Beyond the physical garments, the collection includes tools and materials related to clothing production, scrapers for processing hides, awls for punching holes, bone knives for cutting, bundles of sinew thread preserved in their original birch bark containers. These objects fill in the process, showing not just the final products but the means of production, the technology that transformed raw materials into finished garments. Some tools show extensive wear, their working surfaces polished smooth by repeated use, signs of maintenance and repair suggesting they were valued possessions kept functional across long periods. Others appear barely used, their edges still sharp, their surfaces unmarked, suggesting they were made and then set aside, perhaps as spares, or perhaps intended for someone who never needed them, circumstances changing before the tools found their purpose. The presence of multiple scrapers of different sizes and shapes suggests specialization, different tools for different materials or different stages of processing, a sophisticated toolkit that reflects accumulated knowledge about how to work efficiently. Teaching must have occurred, knowledge passed from experience to novice, techniques demonstrated and practiced until they became automatic, competence built through repetition and correction and gradual mastery. But we have no records of this teaching, no descriptions of how skills were transmitted, whether through formal apprenticeship or casual observation, whether learners were children or adults, whether gender determined who learned which skills or whether necessity overrode such social structures. The tools exist, mute evidence of capability, but the human relationships that maintained and transmitted that capability remain invisible. In recent years, the museum has begun working with Indigenous community members and historical reenactors to attempt experimental archaeology, actually using these techniques to create garments, testing hypotheses about how things were done and what challenges makers faced. These experiments have yielded surprising insights. Techniques that seem straightforward in description prove fiendishly difficult in practice, requiring skills that take months to develop and physical strength or endurance that modern bodies often lack. What appears in an artifact as a simple seam reveals itself. In the doing, as the product of deep expertise, dozens of micro-decisions and adjustments invisible in the final result, but crucial to success. The reenactors speak with newfound respect for the people who made these garments, their attempts at replication revealing how much skill lies hidden in objects that appear simple, how much knowledge must be embodied to produce work that functions reliably in extreme conditions. One participant described spending 40 hours tanning a single hide, following traditional methods, and still producing inferior results compared to archaeological examples. Her respect for ancient expertise growing with each exhausting hour of labor. These experimental projects also reveal how much we don't know, techniques that we thought we understood, proving to depend on details no one thought to record, failures that send researchers back to the artifacts looking for clues they missed, the physical attempt to replicate exposing gaps in our theoretical understanding. It is humbling and illuminating in equal measure, the past refusing to yield its secrets easily despite our best efforts to recover them. The regional variations within the collection suggest different communities develop distinct solutions to shared problems, local innovations that spread or remained isolated depending on contact patterns and terrain. Northern settlements show more seal fur and marine mammal leather, their clothing reflecting coastal access and the materials it provided. Interior settlements rely more heavily on forest animals, their garments dominated by elk and reindeer, occasionally fox or bear, resources determined by ecosystem rather than by preference. But within these broad patterns, specifics vary. One settlement's preferred seam technique differs from another's. Closure systems show community-specific variations. Decorative elements cluster in ways that suggest local traditions or perhaps the influence of particularly skilled individuals whose innovations were copied by neighbors. Mapping these variations creates a picture of cultural diversity even within the broader category of frontier settlers, distinct communities maintaining their own identities through material choices and technical preferences, boundaries of practice that might have been invisible in other aspects of life but that show up clearly in clothing construction. Trade networks become visible through these variations, exotic materials showing up far from their sources, techniques spreading along travel routes, innovations moving through connected communities while remaining unknown to isolated ones. The collection is, in this sense, a snapshot of a complex social landscape, patterns of connection and separation written in fur and thread, the map of who knew whom and who exchanged what with whom recoverable through careful analysis, even without written records or direct testimony. As you drift towards sleep, let these mysteries settle gently in your mind. The decorated needles, the colored threads, the oversized mittens, the songs that may have been prayers, the garments that were more than fabric, all of them represent the complexity of human life, the way practical necessity and spiritual meaning interweave, the way even the most basic acts of survival can carry layers of significance we can barely perceive. The people who lived these lives, who made these objects, who developed these techniques and performed these rituals, are gone, their voices silent, their faces unknown, their individual personalities and dreams and fears lost to the enormous gulf of time that separates us from them. But the traces they left behind remain, preserved in permafrost and museum collections, fragmentary and incomplete, but still present, still real, still capable of teaching us if we approach them with patience and humility. They remind us that human beings have always been more than their circumstances, that even in the harshest conditions, people found ways to create meaning, to invest their labor with care, to reach across the boundary between the physical and the spiritual in search of protection and hope. The frontier was brutal, survival was difficult, and death was common, but within those constraints people still found ways to be human in the fullest sense, creative, social, spiritual, caring for each other and for the next generation, maintaining traditions and innovating new solutions, balancing practical needs with symbolic meanings in ways that made life bearable and sometimes even beautiful. Let their mystery be a comfort as you rest, a reminder that not everything needs to be explained or understood, that sometimes the questions themselves are more valuable than any answer we might construct. The decorated needle does not need to reveal its purpose to be beautiful, its spirals carved with care, regardless of whether we understand their meaning. The colored thread does not need to explain itself to be significant, its bright presence in dark fabric carrying weight, regardless of whether we can decode its message. The child's coat with its communal stitches touches something in us, regardless of whether we can prove those stitches were prayers. The care evident in every piece reminding us that love and protection are not modern inventions, but ancient constants expressed through whatever means each culture and time makes available. They existed, these objects, and the people who made them, they were made with care, and they endured long enough to reach us across the centuries, carrying their questions and mysteries like precious cargo delivered to descendants who never knew them but can still recognize in the careful stitches and deliberate choices something fundamentally human and familiar. That is enough. The objects rest in their climate-controlled darkness, slowly yielding to time despite our efforts, but for now they remain, witnesses to lives lived at the edge of endurance, to skills hard-won and carefully applied, to the endless human effort to protect and preserve and create meaning, even when circumstances suggest that survival alone should consume all energy and attention. They deserve our attention, our careful study, our willingness to sit with uncertainty and resist the urge to force premature conclusions. They deserve to keep their mysteries, at least some of them, to remain partially unknown despite our scrutiny, reminding us that the past is truly another country, that the people who lived there thought thoughts and believed things we can never fully recover. That understanding has limits even when evidence remains. And in that partial knowing, that respectful uncertainty, perhaps we come closest to honoring the people who made these things, acknowledging both their humanity and their otherness, recognizing them as kin across time, while accepting that their specific experiences and beliefs remain, in important ways, beyond our reach. Sleep now, and let the mysteries rest with you, the spirals and the colored threads, the songs and the stitches, the endless patient labor of people you will never meet, but whose work you can still touch through glass and across centuries, their hands reaching forward through time with gifts we are still learning to receive. In the town of Yakutsk, some 300 kilometers from the settlements we have been visiting in our quiet journey, life moved at a different rhythm. The town was not large by the standards of European Russia, but on the Siberian frontier it represented something approaching civilization. Wooden buildings with proper foundations, streets that were cleared of snow with some regularity, a small garrison of soldiers, a handful of merchants, administrative officials sent from distant capitals to oversee the collection of taxes and the maintenance of order. And in this town, winter was still winter. The same brutal cold, the same darkness, the same wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. But the experience of that winter, the daily texture of it, was fundamentally different for those with wealth and position. Consider the morning of a merchant named Pyotr Andreevich Sokolov, a man who had made his fortune in the fur trade and who maintained a substantial household in the better section of town. His dwelling was not a zemlyanki dug partially into the earth, but a proper two-story structure built from carefully fitted logs with moss and clay chinking, sealed with resin to prevent drafts. Inside, a large ceramic stove dominated the main room, its mass slowly releasing heat accumulated from the previous evening's fire. The merchant did not wake in darkness to bitter cold that stung his nostrils and froze his breath. He woke in a room that, while certainly cool, was not dangerously so. The embers in the stove still glowed faintly, and a house servant had already risen to feed them, to coax the fire back to life before the master stirred. By the time Pyotr Andreevich opened his eyes, the room was warming, the light from the growing flames casting soft shadows on walls hung with tapestries that provided additional insulation. His clothing was not stiff with frost, because it had been stored inside, near the warmth. He did not need to thaw his garments before wearing them. A servant brought them to him, already warmed, and helped him dress, a service that might seem like mere luxury, but that had practical implications for the preservation of the clothing itself. When garments are handled carefully, when they are not subjected to the stress of being pulled on by cold, stiff hands, when they are stored properly and maintained by someone whose job it is to attend to such details, they last longer, perform better, provide more reliable protection. The underlayers Pyotr wore were linen, but fine linen evenly woven soft against the skin. Over this came a woolen shirt dyed a deep blue, the dye itself a marker of wealth, as it had to be imported at considerable expense. The wool was of better quality than what common settlers had access to, the fleece selected from specific breeds of sheep, known for producing finer fibers, processed by skilled workers who could card and spin it into relatively smooth yarn. The difference might seem minor, but the cumulative effect was significant. Less itching, less irritation, less distraction from discomfort. His outer coat, his shuba, was extraordinary by frontier standards. It was made from fox fur, not the patchwork scraps of multiple animals, but matched pelts selected for uniformity of color and quality. The lining was quilted silk imported along the tea route from China, providing a smooth interior layer that also trapped additional warmth. The coat was heavy, fox fur is naturally dense, but the weight was distributed well, the cut tailored to his body by a professional tailor who understood how garments should hang and move. The collar was trimmed with darker fur, possibly marten, and the closures were carved bone buttons rather than simple ties or toggles. This coat had cost more than many settlers earned in a year. It represented not just warmth, but status, a visible declaration of prosperity and position. And it worked. Pyotr could venture outside in temperatures that would send a poorly dressed person scurrying for shelter. And he could do so with relative comfort, secure in the knowledge that his clothing would not fail him. His boots were equally impressive. They were made by a specialist, a craftsman who worked exclusively on footwear, using leather that had been properly tanned and dyed black. The soles were thick, made from layered leather treated with pine tar for waterproofing and durability. Inside, the boots were lined with felt and soft rabbit fur, creating a warm environment for his feet. He wore wool socks underneath, and over the boots he could pull leather overshoes lined with additional felt, giving him multiple layers of protection against the snow and cold. His feet would still get cold during extended exposure, but not dangerously so, not with the speed and severity that a settler in crude Valenkian bark overshoes would experience. The gloves he wore were lambskin leather, butter soft and fitted to his hands, lined with rabbit fur and designed to allow relatively fine motor control. Over these he could wear heavier mittens when needed, but often the gloves alone were sufficient for his purposes, as he did not engage in heavy outdoor labor that would require the more protective but less precise mitts that workers depended on. Even his scarves were markers of privilege, woven wool in patterns that required skill and time to create, sometimes imported from craftspeople in more settled regions, dyed in colors that indicated both taste and expense. He owned multiple scarves, rotating them as needed, ensuring that each had time to dry properly between uses. This might seem like a trivial detail, but moisture management in winter clothing was critical, and having enough garments to allow proper drying was a luxury that dramatically improved both comfort and garment longevity. The process of Pyotr dressing took perhaps 15 minutes, assisted by his servant, and when complete, he was encased in layers that represented the accumulated expertise of multiple craftspeople: the tanner who had prepared his leather, the tailor who had cut and sewn his shuba, the weaver who had made his scarves, the bootmaker who had constructed his footwear. Each of these specialists had been paid, their labor compensated at rates that reflected skill and scarcity. The cost of the merchant's winter wardrobe, if calculated, would have exceeded the total value of everything a settler family owned: dwelling, tools, clothing, food stores, everything. This disparity was not hidden or denied. It was simply the way things were, accepted by all as natural and inevitable, as much a feature of the social landscape as the cold itself. When Pyotr ventured outside, he moved through a different winter than the settlers experienced. He walked on streets that were maintained, where snow was cleared regularly by workers employed for that purpose. He traveled short distances, from his dwelling to his warehouse or to the homes of other merchants or officials, spending minimal time exposed to the elements. When he needed to travel longer distances, he had access to a horse-drawn sleigh, enclosed and lined with furs, pulled by animals that were well fed and well maintained because they represented valuable assets. Inside the sleigh, wrapped in additional furs, he could traverse kilometers in relative comfort, arriving at his destination. Cold, perhaps, but not dangerously so, not depleted and shaking. The town of Yakutsk contained perhaps a dozen families of comparable wealth: merchants, senior administrative officials, the garrison commander, a few others who had accumulated resources through trade or appointments or inheritance. These families formed a small society within the larger settlement, interacting primarily with each other, maintaining standards of dress and behavior that set them apart from the common population. Their winter gatherings were held in heated rooms, lit by candles or oil lamps rather than the dim glow of a single fire. They served tea imported from China, vodka distilled from grain that settlers could barely afford to eat, preserved fruits and delicacies that represented both wealth and access to supply networks. At these gatherings, clothing served a dual function: warmth and display. The quality of one's shuba, the fineness of one's boots, the imported silk scarves, the jewelry worn even in winter, all of these communicated position, success, taste. Social hierarchy was written in fur and fabric, readable to anyone who knew how to look. A merchant's wife might wear a coat trimmed with sable, that most prized of Siberian furs, dark and lustrous, and impossibly expensive. The coat itself would be tailored to emphasize her figure rather than simply to provide maximum warmth, cut with darts and seams that created a silhouette, even under the bulk of winter clothing. Her hood would be lined with softer fur, perhaps Arctic fox, white and delicate, framing her face. Her mittens would be embroidered with silk thread in patterns that required hours of painstaking work, too delicate for actual heavy use, but perfect for the short distances between heated spaces. These garments were not made by their wearers. They were commissioned from specialists, tailors who maintained workshops in the town, who employed assistants and apprentices, who had access to imported materials and tools that settlers never saw. The relationship between client and tailor was commercial but also personal. A good tailor understood not just measurements but preferences, understood how to balance fashion with function, how to create garments that would impress without sacrificing the warmth necessary for survival. The workshops themselves were environs of privilege. They were heated adequately, allowing for fine work that would be impossible with frozen fingers. They had proper lighting, multiple lamps or candles, allowing precise stitching even during the long, dark months. They had supplies, bolts of fabric, spools of thread in various colors, proper metal needles that did not break or bend, specialized tools for cutting and shaping and finishing. A tailor's apprentice in Yakutsk lived better, at least in terms of working conditions, than most independent settlers. The work was indoors in relative warmth and light. The skills learned were valuable and portable, potentially leading to independent practice and real prosperity. The clothing worn during work was adequate, provided by the master tailor as part of the apprenticeship arrangement. It was not luxurious, but it was functional, maintained properly, sufficient for the limited outdoor exposure that working in town required. The contrast was stark and visible. When a merchant walked through the town's market square, dressed in his matched fox shuba and fine boots, he passed settlers who had come in from outlying areas to trade, dressed in their patchwork coats and crude felt boots, and the difference was immediately apparent. The merchant moved smoothly, his clothing allowing full range of motion because it was well fitted and not overly bulky. The settler moved stiffly, encumbered by layers, by garments that were too large or too small, by makeshift repairs that created awkward bulk or restricted joints. The merchant's face was protected by a well-designed hood that blocked wind without limiting vision or hearing. The settler's face was often wrapped in cloths and scarves, leaving only the eyes exposed because their hoods were inadequate or non-existent. The merchant's hands were gloved, allowing him to handle his business, to count coins, to examine goods, to write in his ledger, without completely removing his hand protection. The settler's hands were in heavy mittens, and any task requiring fine motor control meant exposing bare skin to the cold, working quickly before numbness set in, then covering the hands again as fast as possible. Yet the comfort of the elite was not absolute, and their clothing, while superior, did not grant immunity to winter's dangers. The cold in Yakutsk could reach 50 degrees below 0 Celsius, sometimes colder. At such temperatures, even the finest furs and thickest layers provided only temporary protection. Extended exposure would kill a merchant as surely as it would kill a settler, if perhaps slightly less quickly. The wealthy understood this, and their behavior reflected that understanding. They minimized outdoor time, planned their movements carefully, and maintained a healthy respect for the cold's power. They also worried. Supply routes could be disrupted by weather or by political instability farther west. The caravans that brought imported fabrics and fine furs and other luxuries might not arrive, or might arrive with diminished stocks, driving up prices and creating scarcity even for those with money. Theft was a constant concern. Furs were extremely valuable and relatively portable, making them attractive targets. More than one merchant had discovered his warehouse broken into during the long winter nights. His inventory of pelts vanished, representing losses that could take years to recover from. Fire was perhaps the greatest fear. A stove that heated so effectively could also burn out of control, and winter fires were catastrophic. If your dwelling burned in summer, you could rebuild or move in with neighbors temporarily while making other arrangements. If your dwelling burned in winter, especially during the coldest months, you faced immediate life-threatening exposure. And if you lost your winter clothing in that fire, if the garments that represented such investment and that provided such protection went up in flames, you were suddenly vulnerable in ways that wealth could not immediately remedy. You could buy new clothing, yes, but the finest shuba still required time to commission and construct. Until it was ready, you would have to make do with whatever could be quickly obtained, and you would discover, perhaps for the first time, how thin the line was between comfort and suffering, between status and vulnerability. The priests and officials in Yakutsk faced similar conditions from a different position. They had access to quality clothing through their institutional connections. The Orthodox Church provided its clergy with appropriate garments, understanding that priests could not effectively serve their communities if they were incapacitated by cold. The thick cassocks worn by priests were quilted, lined with wool batting, cut long to protect the legs, with deep hoods that could be pulled over the head. These garments were black, the traditional color of Orthodox clergy, but the dye was expensive and the fabric was good wool, woven tightly to block wind. Over the cassock, priests wore cloaks of heavy felt or fur when traveling between churches or visiting parishioners, and they carried the authority of their position, which granted them entry to heated spaces and some degree of deference, even in the harshest conditions. Administrative officials wore uniforms that, while not as warm as merchant shubas, were still far superior to settler clothing. The uniforms were standardized, representing the distant imperial power, and they came with allowances or provisions for winter wear. An official might receive a coat stipend, money specifically designated for purchasing appropriate cold weather gear, recognizing that the government's representatives needed to be able to function regardless of weather. These officials often had access to military supply chains which could provide boots and gloves and other items manufactured in European Russia and shipped east. The quality was variable. Military supply was notorious for corruption and inefficiency, but even mediocre factory-made items were often better than what could be improvised on the frontier. The garrison soldiers occupied a middle position in the clothing hierarchy. They were issued uniforms including winter gear, but the quality was often poor and the quantities insufficient. A soldier might receive one winter coat, expected to last multiple seasons, and basic felt boots that wore out quickly under heavy use. Soldiers supplemented their issued gear through trade or purchase when they could afford it, and through making do when they couldn't. Guard duty in winter was particularly brutal for soldiers. Standing still for hours in extreme cold, unable to move enough to generate body heat, wearing inadequate clothing, many soldiers suffered frostbite injuries to feet, hands, and faces. Some lost toes or fingers, ending their military service with disability pensions that were barely sufficient for survival. The military's response to this problem was irregular and often inadequate, sometimes providing extra layers or allowing shorter shifts, sometimes simply accepting the casualties as an unavoidable cost of maintaining order in this harsh environment. Within the garrison, there developed an informal economy around clothing modification and repair. Soldiers who had skills as tailors or cobblers could earn extra money or favors by improving their comrades' gear, adding liners to coats, reinforcing boots, creating mittens from scavenged materials. This economy existed in the spaces between official regulations and actual necessity, tolerated by commanders who understood that survival sometimes required flexibility. The town's small medical establishment, a single doctor and a couple of assistants trained in basic care, saw the consequences of clothing failure regularly. Frostbite cases came in waves during the coldest periods, ranging from minor injuries that would heal on their own to severe cases requiring amputation. The doctor could usually tell from examining the affected tissue what kind of clothing the patient had been wearing when injured. Severe frostbite on the toes, but not the feet, suggested boots without adequate insulation. Frostbite on fingertips, but not the whole hand, suggested mittens that were too loose or poorly constructed. Facial frostbite suggested inadequate hood or scarf coverage. Each injury pattern told a story of material failure, of clothing that had not been sufficient for the conditions, of the brutal mathematics of winter, where small inadequacies could compound into serious harm. The doctor's recommendations were straightforward but often impractical: better clothing, shorter exposure times, more attention to early warning signs. But these recommendations ran up against economic reality. People wore the clothing they could afford or make. They stayed outside as long as their work required, and by the time they noticed the early signs of frostbite, the numbness, the pale skin, they were often already committed to remaining outside, unable to return to warmth until their task was complete. The doctor did what he could, treating symptoms, occasionally advocating with authorities for better provisions for soldiers or for aid to particularly destitute families, but ultimately accepting that he was treating the consequences of a system he could not change. The elite, observing these casualties from their position of relative comfort, reacted with a mixture of concern and rationalization. Some genuinely wanted to help, providing old clothing to those in need, employing people in ways that allowed them to earn enough for better gear, supporting charitable efforts organized by the church. Others simply accepted that this was the natural order. Some people had more, some had less, and while the suffering was regrettable, it was not ultimately their responsibility to solve. This attitude was not necessarily cruel, just pragmatic, rooted in a worldview where social hierarchy was seen as inevitable and where one's primary obligation was to one's own family and position. There were moments when these worlds collided in ways that revealed the depth of the divide. A merchant's son playing in the snow near his family's dwelling might encounter settler children who had come to town with their parents. The merchant's son would be dressed in fitted wool clothes under a small but well-made fur coat with proper boots and mittens. The settler children would be in oversized hand-me-down garments, patched and worn, often without proper mittens, their hands wrapped in cloth and stuffed into two large adult gloves. The children might play together briefly, building snow figures or throwing snowballs, and in that moment the differences in their clothing, their situations, their futures would be starkly visible. The merchant's son would be called inside after a reasonable time before he got too cold. The settler children would remain outside until their parents' business was concluded, however long that took, because there was nowhere warm for them to wait. The merchant's clothing would be dried and maintained by servants. The settler children's clothes would be dried by smoky fires in cramped dwellings, and if they didn't dry completely, would be worn damp the next day because there were no alternatives. One child would grow up understanding winter as an inconvenience, something to be managed with the proper resources. The other would grow up understanding winter as a test, something to be endured through determination and constant vigilance. And yet the gap was not unbridgeable in all cases. Wealth on the frontier was less stable than in more settled regions. A merchant could lose everything in a single catastrophic event: fire, theft, a supply caravan that never arrived, a shift in trade routes, a political change that eliminated his connections. The fall from privilege could be rapid and devastating. Conversely, a settler with skill and luck and determination could occasionally rise, accumulating resources slowly, eventually establishing themselves as prosperous, if not quite elite. The clothing people wore could change over a lifetime, could chart a trajectory from poverty to comfort, or from comfort to desperation. A man who wore a patchwork coat at 20 might wear a proper shuba at 50 if fortune favored him. A man who inherited a fine coat at 20 might be trading it for food and wearing rags at 50 if fortune turned against him. The frontier's harsh conditions had a leveling effect that pure wealth could not completely overcome. Everyone, regardless of status, lived with the knowledge that winter could kill. Everyone understood that clothing was not optional, not decorative, but essential. And everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest exile, had to make decisions each day about how to dress, how long to stay outside, how to balance necessity against danger. The difference was that the wealthy had more margin for error, more resources to recover from mistakes, better options when things went wrong. But the fundamental challenge was the same: survive the cold, make it through to spring, and do it again next year. As we drift toward the conclusion of our exploration, consider this final image. A winter evening in Yakutsk, the sun long since set, the temperature plunging toward 40 below. Inside the merchant Sokolov's house, a gathering is underway. Guests arrive wrapped in their finest furs, which they shed in the warm entrance hall, revealing silk-lined coats and embroidered garments underneath. They move to the heated main room, where tea and food are laid out, where conversation flows easily, where the cold outside is an abstraction, something happening in another world. And outside, in the street, a settler walks past the house on his way to the small room he rents in a boarding house at the edge of town. He is wrapped in his patchwork coat, his head down against the wind, his hands buried deep in his mittens. He has been outside for most of the day, first conducting his business, then helping unload a supply wagon in exchange for a small payment, then waiting for hours for a promised meeting with a potential employer that never materialized. He is cold to his core, that deep cold that takes hours by a fire to dispel, that makes your bones ache and your thoughts slow. But he is alive, he is moving, he is enduring. He passes the merchant's house without looking at the lit windows, without resentment or envy, simply accepting that this is how things are. Inside the house, one of the guests happens to glance out the window, sees the figure moving through the darkness, sees the inadequate coat, the hunched posture, the determination in the stride. For a moment, perhaps, there is recognition, an acknowledgement of the common struggle, the shared enemy of the cold, the different weapons each brings to the fight. Then the moment passes. The guest turns back to the warmth, to the conversation, to the comfortable world that wealth has constructed. And the settler continues walking, one foot in front of the other, wrapped in his inadequate layers, carrying himself through the cold with nothing but stubbornness and the hope that tomorrow might be slightly easier. Both survive. Both endure. But they endure differently in worlds that occasionally touch, but never quite merge, separated by layers of fabric and fur, and the vast social distances that frontier life maintained, even as it occasionally allowed to be crossed. As you settle deeper into rest, let this contrast fade gently. Let the differences become less important than the commonality. All of them human, all of them finding ways to face impossible cold, all of them clothed in the best they could manage, whether that was magnificent or merely sufficient. Winter made equals of none, but it challenged all, and in that challenge each found what resources they possessed, and used them as well as they could. And that perhaps is the most we can ask, not that conditions be fair, not that everyone have equal tools, but that each person do what they can with what they have, that ingenuity and determination matter, that even inadequate clothing worn with care can be enough to see another dawn. Let that thought carry you gently forward into the quiet conclusion of our journey, where we will gather all these threads, common and elite, practical and mysterious, individual and communal, and weave them into a final reflection on what it meant to dress for survival in a world that gave no quarter to the unprepared. We have traveled together through a landscape of cold and cloth, through the frozen mornings and endless repairs, through the life of a quiet innovator and the mysteries that remain unsolved, through the stark divisions of wealth and the common thread of survival that bound all people to the same unforgiving winter. Now, as our journey draws to its close, let us rest here for a moment, in this quiet space between past and present, and consider what we have seen. The early settlers who dressed each morning in the darkness, who layered themselves in rough wool and patched fur, who stuffed their boots with moss and wrapped their faces in cloth, these people are gone now, dissolved into time like morning frost under a weak sun. Their names, with few exceptions, were never recorded. Their struggles were never chronicled in official histories. The clothing they made with such care has mostly disintegrated, returned to the earth, leaving only scattered fragments in museum collections and archaeological sites. And yet they were real. They lived through winters we can barely imagine, endured cold that would send us scrambling for heated shelter, and they did it year after year, not because they were exceptional, but because they had no choice. Survival was not heroic for them. It was simply what one did, the baseline requirement for seeing another spring. Their clothing was the physical manifestation of this determination, each garment a small essay on adaptation and endurance. The materials they used came from the world around them: wool from sheep that barely survived themselves, furs from animals trapped in frozen forests, leather scraped and tanned in crude conditions, felt beaten by hand until fibers meshed into dense protection. Nothing was wasted because nothing was abundant. Every scrap of fabric, every snippet of thread, every small piece of fur had value and found its way into the endless cycle of making and repairing and remaking. The labor this required was immense and largely invisible. Hours spent spinning thread in dim firelight, hours spent stitching seams with cold, stiffened fingers, hours spent scraping hides and working leather and dyeing wool. All of this labor disappeared into the finished garment, became invisible in the wearing. When you looked at a settler's coat, you saw a coat perhaps shabby, perhaps patched. You did not see the hundreds of hours of work it represented, the accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, the small innovations and careful adaptations that made it functional. This is the nature of utilitarian craft. When it succeeds, it becomes invisible, taken for granted, unremarkable. Only when it fails do we notice it, do we suddenly become aware of how much we depend on these quiet technologies of survival. Daniil Vasilovich, whose life we traced through its quiet arc, embodied this principle of invisible excellence. He did not seek fame or recognition. He simply saw that people were cold and decided to do something about it, working year after year to refine his techniques and share his knowledge. His hybrid coat design was not revolutionary in any dramatic sense. It did not overturn existing systems or create new industries. It simply worked better than what came before, protected more reliably, allowed people to endure more comfortably. And because it worked, it spread quietly through demonstration and teaching and imitation until it became standard and its origins were forgotten. This is perhaps the truest form of success, to create something so useful that it becomes ordinary, so effective, that it needs no attribution, so integrated into daily life that people cannot imagine having ever done without it. Daniil's legacy was not a name remembered, but a standard raised, not personal glory, but collective improvement. In a world obsessed with individual achievement and lasting fame, there is something profoundly peaceful about this alternative model of significance, to matter deeply in ways that leave no trace, to improve lives without requiring recognition, to work not for posterity, but for the immediate and pressing needs of the people around you. The mysteries we encountered in our third passage, the decorated needles, the buried furs, the strange seams and colored threads, remind us that these people were not purely practical, not merely survival machines optimizing for warmth. They were human, which meant they carried beliefs and hopes and fears that expressed themselves in ways we can no longer fully decode. They invested their labor with meaning beyond the strictly necessary. They created beauty in small ways, carved spirals into needles that needed no decoration, added colored threads to seams that would never be seen. Why? Perhaps for protection, perhaps for identification, perhaps simply because the human spirit needs more than pure function, needs to make things beautiful or meaningful or special, even when, especially when, circumstances are harsh and options are limited. We will never know for certain, and that is acceptable. Not everything needs to be explained or understood completely. The mystery itself has value. It reminds us of the complexity of human experience, of the layers of meaning that can exist in even the simplest objects, of the distance between us and those who came before, a distance that archaeological science can narrow but never quite close. The objects remain, the needles, the fragments of cloth, the oversized mittens, and they speak to us across that distance in whispers we can almost but not quite hear. They tell us that people cared about their work, that they thought about protection in ways both physical and spiritual, that the boundary between practical necessity and ritual meaning was permeable and perhaps not very important to them. They created what they needed and invested it with what mattered to them, and if we cannot fully understand their logic, we can at least respect their intention. The division between wealthy and poor, which we explored in our final passage through Yakutsk's elite society, might seem like a depressing conclusion to our journey, a reminder that survival was never fair, that some people faced winter with fine furs and heated rooms while others made do with patches and drafts. And this is true. The disparity was real, and its consequences were measured in comfort and suffering, in frostbitten fingers and amputated toes, in lives that were harder than they needed to be. But even this inequality was not absolute or permanent. The frontier's harsh conditions meant that wealth was less stable than in settled regions, that fortunes could reverse, that the well-dressed merchant and the poorly clothed settler were not necessarily fixed in their positions. And more importantly, they shared something fundamental. They all faced the same cold, the same winter, the same ultimate test. The wealthy had better tools, but the test itself did not care about their status. Winter was indifferent, as nature is always indifferent, and everyone, regardless of their furs or their connections or their heated rooms, understood that they lived at the mercy of conditions they could not control. This shared vulnerability created a kind of humility, a recognition that human beings, no matter how clever or wealthy or powerful, were small things in a large and often hostile world. Your finest shuba could not protect you from a blizzard if you were caught in the open. Your imported boots could not save you from frostbite if you stayed out too long. Your status meant nothing to the cold, which treated all flesh equally, freezing the rich and the poor with the same impartial efficiency. And so everyone at some level understood that they depended on their clothing, on their knowledge, on their care and attention to detail. Everyone understood that small mistakes could cascade into catastrophe, that the difference between survival and death might be as simple as an extra layer or a properly tied scarf, or the decision to turn back instead of pressing forward. This knowledge, this intimate understanding of vulnerability, shaped how people thought about clothing and how they treated the garments they wore. A coat was not just fashion or even just function, it was life itself, worn on the outside, visible and tangible. When you repaired a seam, you were not just fixing fabric, you were maintaining your lifeline. When you greased your boots, you were not just caring for leather, you were preserving your ability to move through the world safely. Every act of maintenance was an act of self-preservation, and this gave even mundane tasks a kind of sacred quality, a weight and importance that transcended their simple mechanics. As you lie here now in your own time and place, surrounded by comforts that those frontier settlers could not have imagined, consider the distance we have traveled. You do not wake in darkness to scrape frost from your clothing. You do not spend hours each evening repairing seams by firelight. You do not stuff your boots with moss or wrap your face in cloth to breathe safely or wonder whether your coat will hold together through another day. Modern life has granted you freedoms from these specific struggles that would have seemed miraculous to Daniil Vasilievich or to the settler families of the Siberian frontier. Your clothing is manufactured in distant factories, designed by specialists, tested for performance, available in abundance and variety. If something tears, you replace it rather than repair it. If you are cold, you adjust a thermostat rather than building up a fire. You move through winter, if you experience winter at all, with casual ease, barely thinking about the layers you wear, taking for granted that they will protect you, that you will be comfortable, that cold is an inconvenience rather than a threat. And yet something has been lost in this transition. Not the hardship. We should not romanticize suffering or wish for the return of conditions that broke bodies and ended lives prematurely, but perhaps something about intentionality, about the direct relationship between effort and result, about the intimate knowledge of the things we depend on. The settlers knew their clothing in ways we do not know ours. They understood every seam because they had stitched it, every patch because they had placed it, every weakness because they had compensated for it. Their garments were not anonymous products, but personal creations, items with histories, with stories, with the mark of their makers visible in every thread. There is a depth of engagement there, a kind of care and attention that is difficult to maintain in a world of abundance and replacement. We have gained convenience and lost intimacy, gained comfort and lost knowledge, gained ease, and lost the particular satisfaction that comes from creating something with your own hands that then keeps you alive. This is not to say we should abandon modern clothing manufacture and return to hand-spinning wool by firelight. That would be foolish nostalgia, a denial of genuine progress. But perhaps there is value in remembering, in understanding what came before, in recognizing that the ease we take for granted was built on centuries of accumulated knowledge and labor and sacrifice. The settlers who developed these techniques, who tested these materials, who learned through trial and error, and sometimes through fatal mistakes what worked and what did not, they created the foundation for everything that came after. Modern cold-weather clothing, with all its synthetic insulation and engineered fabrics and computer-designed construction, is still fundamentally doing what those rough frontier garments did, creating layers that trap heat, blocking wind and moisture, protecting vulnerable extremities. The materials and methods have changed almost beyond recognition, but the principle remains the same. We are still, at the most basic level, wrapping ourselves in layers to survive the cold, just as humans have done for thousands of years, just as those Siberian settlers did in their frozen mornings. The difference is one of efficiency and comfort, not of basic strategy. And so we owe them something, not gratitude exactly, as they did not labor for our benefit, but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that they lived, that they struggled, that they solved problems that allowed survival in conditions we can barely imagine, and that their solutions, refined and improved, still protect us when we venture into cold. They are our predecessors in the ongoing human project of adapting to environments that do not naturally support our tropical evolved bodies, and their ingenuity deserves recognition even if their names are forgotten. As you drift now into sleep, let the images from our journey settle softly in your mind. See the settler waking in darkness, breathing clouds of vapor, beginning the slow ritual of dressing. See Daniil working by firelight, needle moving with patient precision, creating warmth for neighbors who will never adequately thank him. See the mysterious needles with their spiral carvings, the colored threads woven into hidden seams, the oversized mittens whose purpose we cannot quite determine. See the merchant in his fine shuba, warm and comfortable, and see the settler in his patchwork coat, cold but enduring, both moving through the same winter, both doing what they must to survive. Let these images blur and soften as sleep approaches. Let them become less distinct, less demanding of your attention. The details do not matter now. What matters is the fundamental story. Human beings facing impossible conditions, adapting through ingenuity and determination, creating solutions with whatever materials they had available, and enduring season after season, year after year, until eventually conditions changed or they passed on their knowledge to those who came after. This is the pattern that repeats throughout human history. In every harsh environment, in every challenging circumstance, we adapt, we endure, we create what we need from what we have, and we survive. Not always, not everyone, but enough, just barely enough, to keep the line unbroken, to pass something forward. The clothing they made was temporary, lasting only seasons or years before wearing out and being replaced. But the knowledge endured, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, slowly accumulating, slowly improving, until it became the foundation we stand on now. Think of it as layers, not of fabric, but of time. Each generation adding its own experience, its own small innovations, its own adaptations, building up slowly into the accumulated wisdom that allows us to live comfortably in conditions that once required constant vigilance and effort. We are wrapped now in those layers of accumulated knowledge, insulated not just by synthetic fibers, but by centuries of human learning, protected not just by engineered materials, but by the trial and error of countless forgotten people who tested what worked and discarded what failed. Every time you zip up a winter coat without thinking about it, you are benefiting from that accumulation, from all those cold mornings and frozen fingers and patient repairs, from Daniil and his quiet innovation, and from thousands of others like him whose names we will never know. There is something deeply peaceful about this realization that we are connected to the past not through grand events or famous figures, but through these intimate, practical connections, through the shared experience of being cold and finding ways to be warmer, through the universal human need for protection and the creativity we bring to meeting that need. The settlers are gone, but their solutions remain, transformed and improved, but still recognizable at their core. They shaped the world in small ways that compound into significance, and we live in the world they helped create, wrapped in their legacy every time winter comes. As your breathing slows and deepens, as consciousness begins to fade and sleep takes hold, let go of the details, let go of the names and the dates and the specific struggles. What remains is something simpler, something essential. The image of a person, any person, wrapping themselves carefully in layers, preparing to face the cold, doing what humans have always done when confronted with environments that challenge our survival. We layer ourselves, we protect ourselves, we use what we have, we learn from those who came before, we make do and we endure. And sometimes, if we are fortunate and determined, we improve things slightly for those who come after, leaving the world a little warmer, a little safer, a little more survivable than we found it. This is enough. This is everything. Let this thought be your final companion as you drift into rest. The cold was real and the struggle was genuine, but humans faced it with courage and ingenuity and patient determination, and they survived, and you are here now, comfortable and safe, because they did. The layers they wore are long since dust, but the warmth they created echoes forward through time, reaching even to this moment, to this room, to you, settling into sleep with the knowledge that winter, however harsh, has always been endurable, has always been survived. Tomorrow is distant. Tonight you are warm. Tonight you are safe. Tonight you can rest, wrapped in comfort. Those frontier settlers would have considered miraculous, protected by knowledge they helped create, heir to their struggles and beneficiary of their solutions. Let their memory be a lullaby, soft and distant, a reminder that hardship passes, that humans endure, that the cold of winter always yields eventually to the warmth of spring. But spring is far away and does not concern us now. Now there is only this moment, this quiet darkness, this gentle descent into sleep. The story is complete. The journey is finished. Rest now in peace and warmth, and let the long winters of the past fade softly into dreams where they cannot touch you, where they exist only as quiet stories, whispered across centuries, carrying the message that we survive, always, somehow. We layer ourselves carefully, we face the cold, we endure. And that is enough. Sleep well.